The cold hit his back like a concrete slab. Jin opened his eyes and saw the sky. Not that sky. 2 moons hung in it. One was pale and familiar, the other was huge and red. It hung so low that it seemed he could reach out and touch it. His body wouldn't obey him. His fingers scraped against the rocky ground. His head was throbbing as if someone had driven a stake into it. Jin tried to sit up and nearly passed out again. His hands were thin. They weren't his. He looked at his palms and didn't recognize them. The calluses weren't where they should be. His fingers were too long. His skin was too smooth. These weren't the hands of a foreman with 15 years of experience. These were the hands of a boy. A piece of paper lay in the pocket of his crumpled jacket. Jin pulled it out with trembling fingers and unfolded it. He didn't recognize the characters, but the seal at the bottom was red and bold, and next to it, someone had scrawled 3 words by hand. Later, he would learn what they meant: banished for uselessness. Jin dropped the paper onto the stones and looked up again. 2 moons, a stranger's body, a seal of banishment. He lay at the foot of the fortress wall. The wall was old. The stone was cracked. The masonry had shifted to the left. The angle of inclination was about 5 degrees. The master builder inside him had woken up before the man did. This wall would collapse in 2 rainy seasons, maybe 3, if he was lucky. Jin sat down. His head was spinning. He looked around. The fortress stood on a hill. Small, pitiful, walls of gray stone, cracked. The gate was wooden. 1 leaf hung by a single hinge. Roofs were visible beyond the wall. A dozen, maybe a dozen and a half. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. The rest were cold. A plain stretched out around the fortress. Yellow grass, scattered leafless trees, mountains to the north. To the south, the road disappeared into the fog. The wind blew from the north, cold, -2 or 3. Jin knew this from the way it stung his ears. Next to him lay a pile of old logs. Lumberjacks had abandoned them long ago. The wood had turned gray, the bark had peeled away, but the heartwood was still intact. Jin reached for them simply to brace himself and stand up. His palm touched the nearest log, and the world clicked. It was a distinct click, quiet, dry, as if something had fallen into place. The logs twitched. Jin pulled his hand away and fell backward. Before his eyes, the gray logs rose up. They turned. They settled on top of one another. The grooves fit into the grooves. The corners closed together. The roof slid down from above like a lid on a box. A chimney rose from the corner. The door settled into the opening. The hinges creaked. 8 seconds. Jin sat on the ground and looked at the hunting cabin. Perfect. A log cabin in the rough. Clean crosscuts. A smooth ridge. He'd built ones like this with his father when he was 16. For gamekeepers in Gangwon-do. The same design, the same roof pitch. Jin slowly stood up. He walked over. He touched the wall. The log was warm, solid. He peered inside. The floor was packed down. The walls were fitted together without gaps. The stove was small, stone, with a chimney. He hadn't built this with his own hands. It built itself. No, not by itself. He knew this design. It was in his head. Every log, every groove, every degree of the roof's pitch. And when he touched the wood, something inside him took that blueprint and put it together. Jin stood in the doorway of the log cabin and said nothing. Then he looked at his hands, someone else's boyish hands, and he smiled slowly, for the first time since he'd woken up. So, he really was at the construction site after all. The fortress gates creaked open. A man stepped out, tall, thin, with a military bearing and the face of someone who hadn't slept for 3 days. A short sword hung from his belt, a worn cloak bearing a coat of arms draped over his shoulders. He saw Jin. Then he saw the log cabin, then Jin again, then the hut again. His mouth opened and stayed open for about 10 seconds. It was the commander of Choryeon, Yoon Dae-ho, the father of 19-year-old Yoon Mi-rae, the man who had commanded this backwater for the past 7 years, and who, every year, wrote a report to the capital requesting that they send at least one carpenter. They never sent one. The commander approached the hut. He walked around it. He touched the wall. He peered into the chimney. He looked at Wu Jin and asked who he was. Wu Jin didn't understand a word. The language was foreign, similar to Korean, but not Korean, as if Korean had lived 1,000 years in another world and forgotten half of itself. Wu Jin pointed at the hut, then at himself. Then he spread his arms wide. The commandant looked at the stamped paper lying on the rocks. He picked it up. He read it. His expression changed. Expelled from the academy. Trivial skill. Folding. The commandant looked at the hut again. He stood there for a minute. Then he tucked the paper into his pocket and gestured for Wu Jin to follow him. Wu Jin followed. Inside the fortress, everything was worse than outside. The barracks were falling apart. The roofs were collapsed. The walls were patched with rags. Of the 20 houses, only 8 were habitable. The wind blew through the rest. People looked at Wu Jin with indifference. Just another mouth to feed, just another useless one. The commandant led him to his house. It was the sturdiest building in Chorin, and even here a crack ran up the wall from floor to ceiling. Wu Jin saw it, and his left eye twitched. A professional reflex. That crack ran along a load-bearing wall. The house could collapse any winter. A young woman was sitting at the table, Yoon Mi-rai. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun. Her expression was serious. A thick book lay in front of her, and she was writing something down. The commander said a few words to her. She looked up and gazed at Wu Jin, without interest, without hostility. Just the appraising gaze of someone accustomed to keeping score. How much one eats, how much space one takes up, how useful one is. Wu Jin didn't understand the words, but he understood the looks. He'd seen them at every planning meeting. Prove you're needed, or get out. The commandant pointed his finger at Wu Jin, then at the hut behind the wall. Then he said something to his daughter. Mi-rai stood up and left. She returned 10 minutes later. Her expression had changed. She'd looked inside the hut. She'd touched the walls. She'd peered into the stove. And now she was looking at Wu Jin differently, not with interest, with suspicion. For the next 3 days, Wu Jin studied. The language was difficult, but he had a foundation. The roots of the words clung to his Korean, and his brain built bridges. Mi-rai taught him, silently, patiently. She pointed to an object and said the word. Wu Jin repeated it. She corrected him. By the 3rd day, he could speak in short phrases. I'm building. This is a wall. The water is over there. Give me a stone. The commandant came every evening and asked questions. Who had taught him? How did he know how to build a log cabin? Why had the academy labeled him useless? Wu Jin answered as best he could. No one taught me. I know on my own. They were wrong. The commandant didn't believe him. But he saw the log cabin and touched it and slept in it one night to check. In the morning, he came out and told his daughter that it was warmer inside than in his own house. Mi-rai wrote this down in her book. On the 3rd evening, the commandant woke Wu Jin up. His face was gray. He said one word that Wu Jin already knew. People. They went out onto the wall. Wu Jin looked south. People were coming out of the fog along the road. Many of them, 40 people, maybe more. They were walking slowly. Some were being carried. Half were children, women, old people. Not a single man under 50, refugees. The commandant stood on the wall and watched. His hands gripped the stone parapet. Wu Jin saw his face and understood without words. There was nowhere to house them. There was little food. There were no blankets. It would be -5 at night, maybe -7. These people wouldn't survive the night out in the open. The children certainly wouldn't. The commandant turned to Wu Jin, and Wu Jin saw in his eyes what he had seen many times in the eyes of clients before a project was handed over, the despair of a man who knows he's running out of time. Wu Jin looked down. Behind the wall stood a stack of logs, old ones, half-rotten, scrapped. The locals used them for firewood, but they made poor firewood. Damp, smoky. No one wanted to bother with them. Wu Jin climbed down from the wall. He walked over to the stack. He placed a hand on the top log. He closed his eyes. A blueprint unfolded in his mind, not from this world, from the past, a frame and panel barracks. Project KSHCH-40. He used to build these for workers at northern sites. Double walls, sawdust fill between the walls, thermal insulation, a potbelly stove in the center, 2-tiered bunks, 20 sleeping places on each side, a door with a vestibule to keep the cold from blowing in directly, ventilation through the ridge. He had the entire blueprint memorized, every board, every groove, every nail. 30 years and 3 generations of foremen had ingrained this design into his very bones. Jin opened his eyes and pressed the button. The world clicked again. Louder. The stack exploded into motion. Bar ord flew up. They spun around. The rotten parts fell away like husks. Sound wood found sound wood. The walls rose. The roof settled into place. The stove was built from stones lying nearby. The chimney rose. The door went up. The vestibule closed. 8 seconds. In front of the fortress stood a long, warm barracks for 40 people. Smoke began to rise from the chimney. Jin staggered. His head spun. He leaned against the barracks wall and breathed heavily. It was 3 times larger than the hut. The after effects weighed heavily on his temples. But he stood, and the barracks stood. The commandant climbed down from the wall, slowly. He approached the barracks, opened the door, peered inside. Warmth hit him in the face. The stove was already burning. The bunks stood in neat rows. The walls kept the wind out. He closed the door, turned to Wu Jin, and slowly sat down in the snow. Just sat down. His legs wouldn't hold him. Mira stood behind him. In the morning, Wu Jin couldn't get up. His body lay on the floor of the hunting lodge like a sack of cement. His head was buzzing. His arms wouldn't rise above his waist. The after effects of yesterday's barracks construction had completely overwhelmed him. He lay there until noon. Mireille brought him a bowl of porridge. She set it down beside him. She didn't say a word. She left. Wu Jin ate the porridge. It was bland and watery, but hot. He lay there and thought, an 18-year-old's body. His strength was formidable, but it was consuming him like a jackhammer guzzles gasoline. He wouldn't be able to assemble 2 barracks in a row, so he needed to use his head, not his strength. As always. By evening, he was able to get up. He went out for some fresh air. The fortress went about its quiet life. Smoke from the chimneys, the smell of cooking, children's voices from the barracks, lively voices. Jin walked along the wall. His foreman's eye worked automatically. The masonry on the north side had sagged 12 centimeters. The foundation had been eroded by groundwater. The gate hung crooked because the right post had rotted at the base. There was no gutter. Water from the roofs poured directly down the walls and was eroding them. There was no drainage. There was no ventilation in the living quarters. People breathed in their own steam in the closed rooms, and by morning the walls were covered with frost on the inside. Wu Jin stopped in the middle of the courtyard and pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He had picked up this gesture from his father. That's what his father would do when he saw a sight that made him want to. Churyong was not a fortress. Churyong was a dilapidated structure. It survived only because of sheer luck. One harsh winter, one siege, one heavy downpour, and it would all come crashing down. Wu Jin returned to the hut and began to sketch. With a stick on the hard-packed earthen floor, lines, angles, distances. He was sketching a plan of Choryong from memory. He'd walked around the fortress just once, but that was enough. A foreman doesn't see a structure with his eyes. He sees its skeleton, where the load-bearing elements are, where the decorative ones are, where the weak links are. Wu Jin sketched and muttered to himself, the north wall. We need a buttress. No, 2 buttresses. Pour more concrete into the foundation. A drainage ditch around the perimeter. Divert the roof runoff away from the walls. The gate. Replace the post entirely. No. Better to put up stone supports. Wood rots. Stone lasts. Mireille was standing in the doorway. She was looking at his drawings on the floor. She didn't understand the lines, but she could see that it was a plan of the fortress. Wu Jin pointed to a crack in the wall of the commandant's house, then to his drawing. Then he drew a line down from the crack. The foundation. The problem is with the foundation. Mi Rui tilted her head. Then she left and returned with her father. The commandant looked at the drawing. Wu Jin explained as best he could. His vocabulary consisted of 50 words, but construction is a universal language. He gestured, he pointed with his finger. He drew. The commandant frowned, then he nodded and said one word. Do it. On the 4th day, Wu Jin began to work, but not with skill, with his hands. He picked up a shovel and began digging a drainage ditch along the north wall. The people in the fortress watched him. An outcast from the academy was digging a ditch. 3 men from the garrison approached and asked what he was doing. Wu Jin demonstrated. Water flows this way, the wall is wet, the wall is falling, the ditch carries the water away, the wall stands. One of them laughed. He said something that Wu Jin didn't understand, but the tone made it clear. A fool is digging in the dirt. The other 2 walked away. The 3rd stayed. His name was Cho Byung-ho, an old soldier, lame in his left leg. He stood there. He watched. Then, without a word, he picked up a second shovel and began digging beside him. By evening, the ditch was ready, not very deep, but deep enough. Jin laid stones at the bottom, not with any skill, just with his hands, each stone in its place. Each one sloped so the water would flow from the wall toward the hillside. Byung-ho watched and said nothing. He didn't understand why. But he could see that the guy knew what he was doing. On the 5th day, it rained. Icy, vicious. Water gushed from the roofs. Before, it had pounded against the wall. Now it drained into the ditch. The ditch carried it away from the foundation. The wall remained dry. Byung-ho stood in the rain and watched it all. Then he went to Wu Jin's hut. He sat down. And he said that tomorrow he'd bring 2 more men with shovels. On the 6th day, Wu Jin used his skill deliberately for the first time, not on impulse, not in a panic. He found a scattering of stones behind the wall, debris from an old structure. Someone had tried to build a watchtower here a long time ago and abandoned it. The stones were good, granite but scattered about. Wu Jin placed his palm on the nearest stone. In his mind, he held a simple blueprint. A buttress, a retaining wall, with a triangular cross-section. Base, 3 meters. Height, 4. He exhaled and pressed down. The stones rose. They came together. The buttress stood against the north wall as if it belonged there. 4 seconds, the recoil was gentler. His head was buzzing, but his legs held him steady. A small structure, a simple blueprint. Less material, less recoil. Jin understood the rule. The simpler the structure, the easier the recoil. The more complex and larger it is, the harder it is. A barracks for 40 people was his current limit. 2 barracks in a row would make him pass out, so he needed to grow. Or he had to be smarter. He chose the latter. Over the next few days, he built 3 more buttresses, 1 per day. Each time he lay down for an hour after finishing. But the wall stopped leaning. Stone upon stone, the load was distributed. The north wall, which was supposed to collapse in 2 years, will now stand for 20. Mi Rui recorded everything, every buttress, every trench, every stone. She kept track of materials, expenses, and labor hours. Jin hadn't asked her to do this. She started on her own. When he saw her records, he paused. Tables, columns, numbers, wood consumption, stone consumption, number of workers, work hours. It was a cost estimate. Rough, without formulas, but the logic was the same. Wu Jin looked at Mi Rui with respect. She was doing this without an education, without textbooks, simply because someone had to keep track. Otherwise, everything would fall apart. He said one word to her that he'd learned yesterday. Good. She nodded and went back to her records. On the 10th day, the commandant gathered the entire garrison, 12 soldiers. He stood before them and spoke. Wu Jin could only catch a word here and there, but he got the gist. This man is not the enemy. This man is building. Don't get in his way. Help him if he asks. The soldiers looked at Wu Jin, an outcast, a kid, a trashy skill, But the wall was standing stronger than yesterday, and the barracks were standing, and the 43 people inside were alive. Byung-ho stood next to Woo Jin, a lame old soldier. He didn't say a word, he just stood there. That was enough. By the end of the second week, Woo Jin was already speaking coherently, not fluently, but enough to explain what he needed. A rock from over there, a piece of wood here. Dig here, don't dig there, we need clay. Lots of clay. He built stoves out of the clay, 6 of them, 1 for each living quarters, small, simple, but with a chimney and an air vent. The locals didn't know what an air vent was. They burned fires in open hearths, and the smoke filled the room. People coughed all winter. The children were sick. Woo Jin installed stoves with enclosed fires. The smoke went up the chimney. The heat stayed inside. The wife of one of the soldiers came to see him the next morning. She didn't say a word. She just brought a pot of hot soup and set it by his door. Then she bowed and left. Woo Jin stood in the doorway and looked at the pot, soup, behind the stove. In his past life, he'd been paid in money for his work. Here, he was paid in food, and that was the right way. In the third week, a second wave of refugees arrived, 17 people. They already had somewhere to go. The barracks could accommodate 20 more. Mira met them at the gate. She wrote down their names, assigned them places, handed out blankets. Woo Jin watched her and thought that this girl, at 19 years old, was shouldering the burden that an entire logistics department used to handle in a past life. That evening, he sat down and began sketching again. Not a fortress, a settlement. If people keep coming, and they will, war is coming from the north, refugees will keep coming. 40, then 100, then 300. Choryong isn't ready. Not with walls, not with food, not with water. We need a well, a proper one, with a pump. The locals hauled water from a stream half a kilometer away. In winter, the stream froze over, and they melted snow. Woo Jin pinched the bridge of his nose. Snow, they're melting snow. There's an aquifer 20 meters from the wall. He could feel it. By the end of the first month, Choryong had changed. Not beyond recognition, but noticeably. The walls stood straight. Water flowed from the well. The stoves provided heat. The drainage system worked. 4 new barracks had sprung up in 3 weeks. Woo Jin built one every 3 or 4 days. 1 day for assembly, 2 days for rest and manual labor. He alternated between skill and manual labor. Skill for the framework, manual labor for the details, fitting a door, leveling a threshold, sealing cracks with clay. This didn't require magic, it required experience. The population of Choryong had grown to 120. Refugees were arriving, not in a flood, in a trickle, 5 at a time, 10 at a time, 20 at a time, all from the north, all with the same story: fire, ashes, black soldiers who take no prisoners and do not loot. They simply burn, city after city, village after village. Mireille recorded each one, name, age, where they were from, what skills they had. Jin was struck by the last part, what they could do. She'd come up with that herself. Among the refugees were a blacksmith, 2 seamstresses, a 1-armed carpenter, a female doctor, an old man who knew horses, and a woman who'd been brewing beer for 30 years. Mireille wasn't just counting people, she was counting resources. Woo Jin looked at her lists and said, "You're my head of—" Mireille didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was a compliment. She nodded and went back to work. On the 32nd day, So-ha-un arrived. At that moment, Woo Jin was standing knee-deep in a pit, cursing at the soil. The clay was too rich. He wanted to mix a plaster solution, but it kept clumping together. In his past life, he would have added sand. Here, there wasn't enough sand. He tried crushed stone. Not quite right. He tried ash. Closer, but still not quite right. He stood in the pit, caked in clay from head to toe, muttering something about the particle-size distribution of the aggregate. Then he heard the clatter of hooves. A horse pulled up to the gate. White, well-groomed, expensive. Riding it was a girl in the uniform of the Academy of the Five Towers, a red cloak, a silver clasp, hair as black as her waist, a beautiful, yet fierce, face. So, Ha-un, 22 years old, a top-ranking firebearer, valedictorian, the pride of the Faculty of Destruction. She dismounted and looked around. Her eyes swept over the fortress. New walls, barracks, a well with a pump, smoke rising from the stoves, people, children running between the houses. A woman carrying water from the well, an old man repairing a fence. This didn't look like a backwater on the border where unwanted people were dumped. It looked like a village, lively, busy. So Ha-un frowned. She had come here with a specific purpose, to see Kang Woo-jin, the very one, trash skill, exiled for being useless. At the academy, his name had become a joke, the stacker, a guy who knows how to stack things in a pile. Very useful. So Ha-un wanted to see the pathetic outcast in this pathetic backwater and make sure the system was working properly. The useless are weeded out, the useful remain. Everything according to merit. Instead, she saw a settlement of 120 people that had been in ruins just a month ago. The commandant came out to meet her. He bowed. He recognized the academy uniform. The red cloak signified combat rank. You don't argue with people like that. So Ha-un asked where the folding master was. The commandant pointed. She turned and saw Woo-jin. He was standing in a pit, caked in mud with clay in his hair. His face bore the expression of someone solving a problem, oblivious to everything around him. He looked like a laborer, not a mage. So Ha-un approached the pit and looked down from above. Woo-jin looked up. He saw the red cloak, the silver clasp, the beautiful angry face, and he went back to the clay. So Ha-un wasn't used to being ignored. She said, "You're Kang Woo-jin." He nodded without looking up. She said, "I'm So Ha-un, from the academy." He nodded again. He fiddled with the clay. So Ha-un stood over him and felt her blood boil inside. She'd traveled 5 days just to see him, and he wasn't even looking at her. She said, "I heard you're building something here. I want to see it." Woo-jin finally straightened up. He looked at her. He climbed out of the pit, wiped his hands on his pants, and said, "Let's go." He led her through Koran, in silence, showing her around. Walls, barracks, a well, stoves, drainage ditches. She followed him and looked. She didn't understand half of what she saw. The drainage ditches meant nothing to her. The buttresses meant nothing to her. But she understood the barracks. She went inside. It was warm. Bunk beds, children sleeping. A woman feeding a baby by the stove, clean, dry, quiet. So Ha-un came out and said nothing. Then she asked, "Did you build this with your skill?" Jin nodded. She asked, "How long did it take?" He held up his fingers. 8 seconds. So Ha-un stared at him. Then at the barracks. Then back at him. She opened her mouth and closed it. Then she said, "That's impossible." Jin shrugged. The barracks stood before her. People lived there. It was warm and sturdy. Whether it was possible or not, it stood there. So Ha-un stayed in Chorwon. She didn't say she would stay. She simply didn't leave. On the first day, she walked around the fortress and looked around. On the second day, she walked around and felt angry. On the third day, she went to Woo-jin and said that the wall on the south side was weak. Woo-jin looked at her, then at the wall. The wall on the south side was fine. He'd started with the north side because it was in worse shape there. So Ha-un didn't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition, but she was trying to help, in her own way. Woo-jin said, "The south wall is solid, but thanks." So Ha-un clenched her teeth and walked away. That evening, Mi-rae approached Woo-jin. She said that the fire mage from the academy hadn't left. Woo-jin said he'd noticed. Mi-rae said she was walking around the fortress, looking at everything as if she were searching for a mistake. Woo-jin said, "Let her look. She won't find anything." Mi-rae looked at him. Something flashed in her eyes. Something flashed across her gaze. Jealousy. No, not jealousy. Concern. A newcomer, from the academy, a red cloak, a combat rank. Why is she here? Woo-jin wasn't thinking about that. He had another question: where to get sand? On the 5th day of So Ha-eun's stay at the fortress, a third wave of refugees arrived. 31 people. And with them came bad news. The city of Namhae, 40 kilometers to the north, had been burned to the ground completely. The ashes had reached Namhae. The commandant shut himself in his house for 2 hours. When he came out, his face was ashen. Namhae was the nearest city, the only one between Koran and the front line. Now it's gone. Now there's nothing between Koran and the Empire of Black Ash. No walls, no garrisons, no buffer zone. Jin stood on the wall and looked north. The wind carried a smell, bitter, metallic, ash. He hadn't seen the Empire yet, but he could sense it. It smelled like a burning construction site. He knew that smell. A fire at a construction site, when what you've been building goes up in flames, suffocating, nauseating. So Ha-eun stood beside him. She, too, was looking north. Her face was tense. She said, "If they come here, I'll burn them." Wu Jin shook his head. She turned to him, her expression angry. He said, "You'll burn 10, maybe 20. There'll be 1,000 of them." She clenched her fists. She knew he was right, but she didn't want to admit it. Wu Jin said, "We need a wall, a real one, not this one." He pointed to the fortress wall of Choryeon. It had been repaired, reinforced. But it was the wall of a small border fortress. It wouldn't hold against a serious army. Wu Jin went downstairs. He walked behind the wall. He stepped out onto the plain. He stood up. He looked around. He placed his palm on the ground. He closed his eyes. The soil beneath him told him everything. Loam up to 2 meters deep. Then clay. Dense. Good quality. Beneath the clay, bedrock at a depth of 6 meters, an aquifer at 4 meters, a 3-degree slope toward the east, wind from the north. The wind direction is predictable. The enemy will come from the north along the road, or across the field to the left. There are no other routes. Mountains to the right, a ravine to the left, a narrow corridor. Wu Jin opened his eyes. He was standing in the perfect spot for a fortress. Whoever built Choryeon here 200 years ago knew what they were doing. They just built it poorly. Or they built it in a hurry. Or they didn't know any better. Wu Jin returned to the fortress. He sat down in the hut and began to sketch, not repairs, not patches. A new wall, a full-fledged fortress wall with a foundation set in bedrock, with loopholes at the correct angles, with towers on the flanks, with gates that could withstand a battering ram, with an inner courtyard where 500 people could take shelter. He drew all night. In the morning, he showed the plans to the commandant. Yoon Dae-ho looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he said, "This will require stones, a lot of stones." Wu Jin nodded. He knew where to get the stones. The ruins Namhae, a burned-down city 40 kilometers away. Stone doesn't burn. The walls have collapsed, but the stone remains. Charred, cracked, but still stone. The commandant shook his head. 40 kilometers. Carts, horses. They have 2 horses. One was lame. The road was in ruins. It would take months of work. Wu Jin fell into thought. Then he looked at So Ha-eun, who was standing in the doorway, listening. She caught his gaze and frowned. He said to her, "You can melt stone, can't you?" The wall grew, slowly, but it grew. So Ha-eun melted stone every day. Wu Jin made wooden formwork. She poured the molten granite into the molds. The blocks came out smooth, heavy, stronger than anything this world had ever seen. Fired stone, melted by a top-rank firemaster. Wu Jin would place his palm on the finished blocks and assemble them into sections of the wall, 1 section per day. Each section was 3 meters long, 2 meters high, and half a meter thick. He built the foundation separately. He dug down to bedrock. He filled the trench with stone and clay. He tamped it down. Only then did he install the section. The locals didn't understand why he was digging so deep. After all, the wall stands on the ground. Why go underground? Wu Jin explained it every time. The wall stands on the foundation. The foundation stands on the soil. If the soil is weak, the wall will fall. Not right away, in a year, in 5 years, but it will fall. They nodded. They didn't understand. But they dug. Byung-ho became the foreman. Wu Jin didn't appoint him. It just happened. The old soldier organized the men from among the refugees. He divided them into groups. Some dug, others hauled stone, still others mixed clay. He didn't ask Wu Jin how to do it. He knew on his own. 30 years in the army had taught him one thing: people work when they know why. Byung-ho explained why. The wall, the enemy, life, simple. On the 45th day, a caravan arrived in Choryong. 12 carts, half were empty, 4 were loaded with goods, 2 carried people. The caravan had set out from the southern kingdom of Zhonghe, bound for Namhai to trade. Namhai no longer existed. The caravan members had learned this from refugees they met along the way. They had nowhere else to go. The road back was long. The horses were exhausted. The people were freezing. They saw Choryong and turned off the road. Among them was Emily Wright, 20 years old, the daughter of a trade envoy from a foreign country. She was sitting in the last wagon. Her clothes were expensive but dirty and torn. Her face was pale. Her eyes were too bright for someone who sleeps normally. She spoke 4 languages: the local tongue, the language of the southern kingdom, the language of her homeland, and the trade pidgin used by merchants on the coast. She smiled a lot and loudly. She chattered nonstop, joked with the caravan drivers, and flirted with the soldiers at the gate. She laughed. Jin had seen people like that on construction sites. Those who joke and laugh the loudest are usually on the verge of a breakdown. Emily saw the fortress and stopped. She fell silent for a second. Then she smiled again and asked the nearest soldier if there was an inn here. The soldier didn't understand her. She repeated it in another language. He pointed to the barracks. Emily looked at the barracks. New, sturdy, warm, a well with a pump nearby, a wall under construction nearby, people working nearby. She turned to the caravan leader and said she would stay here. The caravan leader shrugged. Wu Jin found out about her that evening. Mi Ray came with the records. New. Emily Wright. 20 years old, speaks 4 languages, knows about trade, an ambassador's daughter. Wu Jin asked what she could do. Mi-ra said, "Speak." Wu Jin thought for a moment. Then he said, "All right, I need someone who can speak." The next morning, he found Emily by the well. She was washing herself with cold water and shivering. She saw him and instantly put on a smile. She said something cheerful. Wu Jin wasn't listening. He said, "You know the language of trade." She nodded. He said, "I need iron. A lot of iron. There isn't any here. Can you find out who's selling it and for how much?" Emily blinked. Then her smile changed. It became genuine. For a single second, someone had asked her to do what she was good at, not to smile, not to chat, not to flirt, but to work. She said, "Give me 2 days." 2 days later, she came to Wu Jin with her report. She'd questioned the caravan drivers. She'd found 3 iron suppliers in the southern kingdom. She'd learned the prices, the routes, delivery times, risks. She drew up a table. On what? On a scrap of cloth, with ink made from ash. The table was neat. The columns were even. The numbers were clear. Wu Jin looked at this table and saw before him not a 20-year-old girl, but a logistics expert. He said, "All right." She said, "We don't have any money." Wu Jin said, "I know," she said, "but we have stone." She pointed to the blocks that Soha-un melted down every day. Fused granite, stronger than usual, beautiful, with a distinctive luster. "You can't find stone like this anywhere else," she said. "Building stone of this quality is expensive down south, very expensive. They build palaces out of limestone that crumbles in 10 years, but this stone will last 100. Wu Jin paused. He looked at the blocks. He thought of them as building material. She thought of them as merchandise. He built. She calculated. Together, it worked. He said, "How many blocks per metric ton of iron?" She said, 12, according to my calculations. He said, "Get to work." Emily got to work. She made a deal with the caravan drivers. They would haul the stone south and bring back iron on the return trip. The caravan driver's markup was 20%. Emily haggled it down to 15. Wu Jin didn't interfere. He was building a wall. On the 50th day, Li So-yan arrived, 24 years old, a military engineer, a veteran. Her left hand bore a scar from a burn. She had fought on the northern frontiers 2 years ago. Her unit had been burned to the ground. She survived. The scar remained. She arrived in Chor-ryong on orders from the capital. To investigate, rumors had reached the capital. Someone was building something at the border, quickly, a lot. Strange, the capital wanted to know who and why. Li So-yan entered the fortress and began her inspection. Silently, methodically. She walked along the walls, touching the stones. She checked the masonry. She tapped on the blocks. She peered into the joints. She climbed down into the foundation trench. She examined the base. She checked the slope. She climbed back up, walked over to the well. Checked the well casing, the pump. She approached the barracks, inspected the rafters, felt the insulation, the backfill between the walls. 2 hours. She walked around Choron for 2 hours without saying a word. Wu Jin didn't interrupt her. He stood next to the wall and waited. He knew that look. That's how an inspector looks. Neither enemy nor friend, a professional. Li So-yan finished her inspection. She walked over to Wu Jin. She looked at him. At the wall. At the barracks. At the well. Then she said, "The angle of the embrasures on the northern section is 18 degrees. That's correct for firing downwards from your wall's height. Who did the calculations for you?" Wu Jin said, "I did." She paused. Then she said, "The foundation goes down to bedrock perimeter drainage, buttresses to counteract earth pressure, a double wall with backfill. I've seen this once before in the blueprints of an old imperial fortress that's 300 years old. Nobody builds like this anymore." Wu Jin said, "It's not magic, it's engineering." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I came here to inspect. The inspection is complete. You build better than anyone I've ever seen. I want to stay." Wu Jin asked, "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I spent 30 years building siege engines, battering rams, trebuchets, assault towers. Everything I built was meant to destroy what others had built. Here they build so that people can live. I want to try." Wu Jin nodded. She stayed. Li So-yan was different, not like Byung-ho, not like Mirei, not like So Ha-yun. She was an engineer, a real one. She understood blueprints, she calculated loads, she knew the properties of stone and wood, not like Wu Jin, in a different way, in a military way. But the foundation was the same. Physics, geometry, common sense. On the third day, she came to Wu Jin with revisions to his wall blueprint. The towers on the flanks should be round, not square. A round tower has no blind spots for firing. She was right. Wu Jin had seen this solution in books, but hadn't used it because circular masonry is more difficult to construct skillfully. A circular shape isn't straight lines, it's a radius. It requires calculating every row. But So-yan was right. He redrew the towers, round, on the same foundation, 4 towers at the corners, each 6 meters in diameter, each 10 meters tall. This was his new challenge, harder than a barracks, harder than a buttress. He completed the first tower on the 53rd day. The stone rose in a spiral, row by row. Wu Jin stood in the center and kept every block in his mind, every angle, every joint. 12 seconds. The tower stood. He fell. So-yan caught him. He came to 2 hours later. His head was splitting, but the tower stood. Smooth, round, with spiral battlements. So-yan stood beside him. She looked at the tower. Her uninjured hand touched the stone. Then she looked at her scorched hand. 20 years ago, with that same hand, she had assembled siege towers that had breached walls, like this. Now she was helping to build. Wu Jin sat down. He rubbed his temples. He looked at the tower, then at So-yan. He said, 3 more like this. She nodded. Over the next week, Wu Jin assembled the remaining 3 towers, one every 2 days, 1 day for assembly, 1 day for backfilling. The wall between the towers grew in sections. By the end of the second month, Cheoryong had a new wall, not completely. The north side was closed off, the west side was half closed, but it was more than the old wall, 3 times higher, twice as thick, with towers that controlled the approaches. So Ha-un stood at the top of the northern tower and looked down. The wind ruffled her hair. She turned to Wu Jin, who had climbed up after her. She said, "A month ago there was a hole here." He said, "It's still a hole. The western wall isn't closed off." She snorted. Then she said, "You're strange." He said, "I'm a foreman." She didn't know that word. Winter struck on the 60th day. The temperature dropped to -15, then to -20. The north wind carried icy pellets that stung their faces and filled their eyes. Wu Jin stood on the wall, looking out at the plain. White, empty, dead. Construction had come to a standstill. It was impossible to dig through the frozen ground. Stone would crack in the cold if you tried to melt it. With Ha-un, she tried and shattered 3 blocks in a row. The temperature difference, red-hot granite in 20-degree frost, shattered like glass. Jin knew this. In his past life, construction had also come to a standstill in winter. But here, winter meant something else. Here, winter killed. The population of Goryeo had grown to 230. The barracks were full. There was little food, little firewood, barely enough heat. Mireille came to him with a book. The numbers were grim. Grain reserves for 40 days, firewood for 25. Winter would last at least 90 days. Wu Jin looked at the numbers. Then he said, "So we need 3 times as much of everything." Mireille asked, "Where will we get it?" He didn't answer. He was thinking. The first problem, heat. The firewood will run out in 25 days. Then people will start to freeze. Then they'll get sick. Then they'll die. The stoves run on firewood. There's no firewood. The forest is far away. The road is snowed in. There's no one to chop wood in the freezing cold. Jin sat down in his hut and began to sketch. Not a building, a stove, a different kind. Not a potbelly stove, an ondol, a Korean heating system. Hot air flows under the floor through channels and warms the entire room. It uses 3 times less fuel than an open stove. Any fuel. Firewood, peat, dry grass, manure, anything that burns. In his previous life, he'd installed ondol systems in country homes. Wealthy clients wanted something exotic. He knew the design down to every brick. The problem was the material. Ondol requires flat stones for the channels, smooth and thin. There aren't any like that here. There are granite blocks, thick and heavy, not what he needed. Wu Jin sat and thought. Then he stood up and went to see So-ha-un. She lived in one of the barracks, separate from the others, in a corner by the wall. She was sitting by the stove, warming her hands. She saw Wu Jin and sat up straight. He said, "I need your help." She said, "Stones again?" He said, "No, clay. I need you to fire some clay, thin slabs, smooth ones. I need a lot." She asked why. He explained, "Channels under the floor, hot air, warmth everywhere, less firewood." She listened, then she said, "You want to put fire under the floor?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That's crazy." He said, "It's an ondol." She didn't know that word. No one in this world did. In the morning, they began. With Ha-un, she fired the clay slabs. She had to work more carefully than ever before. No torrent of fire, no explosion, even heat, a constant temperature. She controlled the flame with surgical precision. Each slab was the same thickness. Each was the same size. It was harder than melting granite. Granite could be cast roughly. Clay had to be fired gently. So Ha-un was frustrated for the first 2 days. The slabs cracked, they burned, they crumbled. She broke them and started over. Wu Jin sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't correct her. He didn't rush her. He just waited. On the 3rd day, she made 10 slabs without a single crack. She looked at them, then at her hands, then at Wu Jin. He nodded. Good. She didn't smile. But something in her eyes had changed. Wu Jin assembled his first ondol system in a barracks for families with children. He cut open the floor. He laid out channels made of the plates. He ran the chimney to the outside. He placed the stove by the entrance. The firebox is at the bottom. Hot air flows through the channels under the floor. It passes through the entire room. It exits through the pipe at the other end. The floor heats up. The walls heat up from the floor. The air warms up evenly. He assembled the ducts by feel. 5 seconds. The panels fit perfectly, groove to groove. Wu Jin lit the stove. The firewood caught fire. 15 minutes later, the floor was warm. 30 minutes later, it was hot. The children who had been sitting on the bunks climbed down and sat on the floor. Then they lay down. Then they started laughing. A warm floor. They had never touched a warm floor before. In this world, floors were cold, always, everywhere, stone and earth, cold from below. People slept on bunks and beds so as not to touch the floor. But here, the floor was warm, as if alive. A woman with a baby laid the child on the floor. The baby stopped crying for the first time in a week. She looked at Wu Jin and couldn't speak. Wu Jin said, "We need 3 times less firewood. We can burn peat or dry grass or anything." The commandant came in the evening. He entered the barracks. He took off his boots. He stood barefoot on the floor. He stood there for a minute. Then he said, "In all the houses." Wu Jin nodded. He was already making plans. Over the next 10 days, he converted all the living quarters. With Hai Yun, she fired up the plates non-stop. Her hands were black with soot. Her nails were broken. Her hair was tied back in a dirty bun. She didn't complain. She didn't make snide remarks. She didn't say she was a high-ranking fire bearer and shouldn't have to do this. She just worked. Firewood consumption dropped by 2/3. Mireille recounted the supplies. Now there would be enough for 75 days. Not 90, but close. Wu Jin said, "Peat." Mireille asked, "Where?" He asked, "A swamp 2 kilometers to the east. I sensed it when I read the soil. A peat layer. Deep. We'll have to dig," she said. "The ground is frozen," he said. "The top layer is frozen. The peat is below. It doesn't freeze all the way through. It's damp, but it burns if you dry it out." Byung-ho took 5 men and went to dig. They broke through the frozen layer in a day. Beneath it was peat, dark, wet, heavy. They hauled it back to the fortress. They piled it up against the walls. So Haun dried it over a fire, carefully, not to burn it, just to dry it. Another task requiring precision. She managed it well. The dry peat burned well, not as hot as firewood, but steadily, for a long time. The ondol ran on the peat like clockwork. Mireille did the math. There would be enough peat to last until spring, with some to spare. She went to see Wu Jin with this news that evening. He was sitting in his hut, drawing. He was always drawing. She told him the numbers. He nodded. She stood in the doorway and didn't leave. He looked up. She said, 7 years. I've been counting for 7 years. Every winter there wasn't enough. Every winter someone died of the cold, the elderly, children. Every spring I wrote down the names of those who didn't make it. She fell silent. Then she said, "This year the list will be empty." Wu Jin looked at her. Then he said, "The list should be empty every year." She nodded, quickly turned away, left. The second problem, food. Enough grain for 40 days. Then famine. Here, Wu Jin was powerless. He's a builder, not a farmer. He can build a granary, but he can't grow grain. Emily solved that. She came to him on the 65th day. She said, "The caravanners are back. They brought iron and something else." She was smiling, a real smile, not a mask. She'd made a deal. The stone blocks were sent south. The southern merchants paid 3 times the usual price for the stone, because there's no stone like this anywhere else. Emily invested the profit in grain, 3 carts of grain, and in cloth, rolls of woolen fabric, warm, thick, and in seeds, a sack of seeds, for spring. Yu Jin looked at the wagons. then at Emily, then back at the wagons. Then he said, "You're a business genius." Emily laughed loudly, too loudly, as always, but this time her eyes weren't empty. Mireille stood nearby and counted the sacks. She kept track: grain, cloth, seeds. Their supplies had increased, enough grain now for 80 days, enough cloth for clothes for 100 people, seeds for spring. Winter continued to bite, 25 below. The wind wouldn't let up, but inside Choryon it was warm, the floors were heated. Peat was burning. There was plenty of food. Children played between the barracks. Women sewed clothes from the new fabric. A blacksmith among the refugees had begun forging items from the iron that had been brought in. Nails, hinges, staples, tools. Wu Jin gave him the blueprints, simple ones, a hammer with the right balance, a chisel with the right sharpening angle, pliers with long handles. The blacksmith looked at the blueprints and shook his head. He'd been forging his whole life, but he'd never seen tools like these. Wu Jin explained, "The hammer shouldn't be heavy. It has to be just right, the weight in the head, the handle fitting the hand, the strike precise, not hard, precise." The blacksmith listened. Then he began to forge. The first hammer came out crooked, the second was better. Wu Jin picked up the third one and said, "This one." On the 70th night, Wu Jin woke up. Something was wrong. He lay there and listened. The wind, the creaking of wood, Beongho's snoring in the neighboring hut, and something else. A low rumble. Not a sound. A vibration. The ground was shaking. He placed his palm on the floor. The ground was vibrating. Slightly, rhythmically, like footsteps. Thousands of footsteps. Wu Jin got up. He got dressed. He went out onto the wall. Night, 2 moons, frost, a white plain, and lights on the horizon, dozens of lights, orange, low, moving. So Ha-Eun stood beside him. She hadn't been sleeping either. She was looking at the lights, and her face was stony. She said one word: Ash, the vanguard of the Black Ash Empire. Not an army, a reconnaissance unit, 50, maybe 70, carrying torches. They were marching along the road from Neamha, straight toward Choron. Wu Jin stared at the lights. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He looked at the wall, at the towers, at the gates. The new wall covered the north and west. The south and east were protected by the old wall. The gates were new, stone piers, oak doors. Li So-yan had personally designed the bolt. It would withstand a battering ram. But the wall wasn't complete. The western section was only halfway, a 20-meter gap between the new section and the old wall. 20 meters of open space. If they find this gap, they will find it. Wu Jin climbed down from the wall. He ran toward the gap. 20 meters. There were no stones. There were no blocks. So Ha-Eun hadn't melted any stone for 3 weeks because of the frost. There was nothing to build with. Wu Jin stopped in front of the gap and looked around. Old planks, debris from the construction site, trash, broken stone, scraps of logs, bent nails, trash, trash. His skill works with materials, any suitable material. But the design has to be in his head. He stood in front of 20 meters of emptiness, and in his mind. Because walls made of trash don't exist. Wu Jin closed his eyes. Walls made of trash don't exist. Not in the textbook, not on site, not in the building codes. But he wasn't in a textbook. He was on a construction site where people with fire would arrive in 2 hours, and behind him were 230 people, half of whom were children. Walls made of trash don't exist, but he was going to build one. He began gathering materials. With his hands, he hauled planks, stones, debris. He piled them up near the breach. Beongho ran up a minute later. Silently, he started hauling things too. Then 3 more arrived, then 5 more. The pile grew. Trash, junk, nothing. Jin placed his palms on the pile. He closed his eyes. A blueprint unfolded in his mind, one that wasn't in any textbook, a wall made of trash, stone for the foundation, planks for the frame, broken bricks for the infill. Straighten out the bent nails and use them as rebar. Clay as mortar, not pretty, not up to code, but it'll stand. Temporarily. For one night, that'll be enough. He pushed. The world didn't click. The world rumbled. The rubble flew up. Swirled around, settled, stone upon stone, plank upon plank, clay in the joints, nails pulled the frame together. 15 seconds. The wall stood, ugly, crooked, patchwork, made of 100 different materials, but a wall. 2 meters high, half a meter thick, 20 meters long, without a single gap. Jin fell to his knees. The recoil hit him like a sledgehammer. His vision darkened. Nausea rose in his throat. He was on all fours, gasping for breath. Byung-ho caught him. He sat him down against the wall. The new wall, the wall of trash. So Ha-un stood on the tower and looked down. At the wall of trash, at Wu Jin on his knees, at the flames approaching. She raised her hands. Fire flared in both her palms. Golden, scorching, fierce. She was ready. Lee So-yeon stepped out to the gate, a sword in her right hand. Her left scorched hand clenched into a fist. 12 garrison soldiers stood on the wall. Their bows were drawn. Men from among the refugees stood behind them with spears, homemade, crude, but sharp. Mireille stood in the courtyard, flanked by women and children. She had assigned everyone their roles, where to run if the wall fell, where to take cover, where the exit was. She didn't panic. She was counting. The torches approached the fortress. They stopped. 53. Jin was having trouble keeping count. His vision was blurring from the recoil. 53 torches, 53 soldiers in black armor with gray ash on their shoulders. They stood before the walls and looked up. They had expected something else, a wooden fence, a rotten gate, a handful of ragged men. Instead, a stone fortress with towers stood before them. Archers watched them from the walls. At the top of the tower, a fire burned in the hands of a torchbearer. The commander of the Ash Squad stood at the front. He stared at the walls for a long time. Then he turned to his men. He said something. The squad turned around and left, back north, into the darkness, without a single shot fired, without a single word. They left because the walls were too high, the towers too strong, the defenders too well prepared. It wasn't worth 53 lives. Wu Jin sat by the rubble wall and watched the lights fade into the distance. He was breathing heavily. His head was splitting. His hands wouldn't obey him. Byung-ho sat down beside him. Silently, Mireille approached from the other side. She brought water. Wu Jin drank. So Ha-un came down from the tower. The fire in her hands had gone out. She walked over to the trash wall and touched it. Wood, stone, clay, nails, all mixed together. She said, "This is the ugliest wall I've ever seen." Wu Jin said, "But it stands." She looked at him, then at the wall. Then she said quietly, "Yes, it stands." By morning, all of Koryon knew what had happened. The Imperial Reconnaissance Unit had approached the walls. They saw the fortress, and they left without a fight. The walls had stopped the enemy, not swords, not magic, not fire. The walls. What one guy with a junk skill had built. The refugees looked at Wu Jin differently, not as a strange builder, but as the person standing between them and the ashes. Emily stood by the gate and looked north. Her arms were wrapped around her shoulders. She wasn't smiling. For the first time ever, Wu Jin walked up to her. She said quietly, "They'll be back." He said, "Yes." She said, "Next time there'll be more of them." He said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to do?" He looked at the trash wall, crooked, ugly, standing there. Then he said, "Build." The reconnaissance squad had left, but not forever. Wu Jin knew that. Lee So-yeon knew that. The commandant knew it. 53 soldiers turned back because the walls came as a surprise. They'll report it. The Black Ash Empire's command will learn that there's a fortress on the border that wasn't there 3 months ago. And they won't send 50. They'll send 500 or 1,000. The only question is when. Lee So-yeon said, "They won't come in the winter. The winter is too harsh. Supplies can't get through on the frozen roads. In the spring, when the snow melts, 2 months. Jin nodded. 2 months. He stood on the wall and looked at the makeshift patch. It was still standing, but it was temporary. One serious attack, and it would crumble. He needed to seal off the western wall completely. He needed to reinforce the southern wall. He needed to finish building the gate. And he needed to do all this during the 2 winter months when construction was impossible. Wu Jin went downstairs. He gathered everyone: the commandant, So Yan, So Ha-un, Emily, Mi-Ray, and Byung-ho. They sat down in the commandant's house. Wu Jin spoke. His language was still a bit stilted but sufficient. He said, "The enemy will come in the spring. We need a wall, complete, with no gaps. Stone can't be quarried in the freezing cold, so we need a different material." So Yan asked, "What kind?" Wu Jin said, "Earth." Silence. Then So Yan said, "The ground is frozen." He said, "Exactly. Frozen earth is stone. It's hard, it's strong. If we take the frozen earth, cut it into blocks, build a wall with them, and pour water over it, the water will freeze and bind the blocks together. A wall made of frozen earth. It'll stand until spring, and by spring he'll replace it with stone." So Yan looked at him. Then she said, "I've never heard of anything like that." Wu Jin said, "I have. In his past life, it was called an ice fortification. The Russians have been building these for centuries. Snow, ice, frozen earth, everything winter gives us for free," Byung-ho said. "Digging through frozen earth is hard," Wu Jin said. "I know, but we have a fire bearer," he added. Everyone looked at So Ha-yun. She straightened up. Wu Jin said, "You don't need to melt it. Just warm up the top layer so the shovel can get in, then we'll cut the blocks, carry them out, and stack them." So Ha-un was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said, "I'll warm up the mud for you." Wu Jin said, "You're going to save 230 people." She didn't answer. They started in the morning, so Ha-un warmed up a patch of ground behind the western wall. A slow, steady heat, not fire, but warmth. The ground thawed to a depth of 1/2 meter. The men cut it into blocks, heavy, wet. They hauled them to the breach. Wu Jin stacked them with practiced ease, block upon block. The frozen earth settled it tightly. He poured water over it. The water froze within minutes. The joint set solidly. The wall grew. Slowly. It was hard work, but it grew. By the end of the first week, the western breach was closed. Wu Jin dismantled the makeshift patch and replaced it with an earthen wall, ugly, dark, but solid, thicker than stone, more durable in the cold. So Yan inspected it. She tapped on it. She felt the joints. She said, "You can withstand a light siege. A battering ram won't break through." Wu Jin said, "There won't be a battering ram. They'll set it on fire. They won't break it down," so Yan thought. Then she nodded. Fire doesn't work well against frozen earth. Too much mass, too much water in the soil. By the time the wall thaws, they'll have expended more energy than they would on a direct assault, if it thaws at all. Wu Jin said, "Exactly." Second week, the south wall, the old stone masonry. Wu Jin didn't tear it down. He lined it with earthen blocks on the outside, a double wall, stone on the inside. Frozen earth on the outside. An air gap between them. Insulation. Stone doesn't freeze through. The earth holds up well. So Yan looked at it and shook her head. Then she said, "This isn't the kind of fortification you see in textbooks." Wu Jin said, "Textbooks don't know about frozen earth." She said, "I'm starting to think textbooks don't know much at all." He almost smiled. By the 80th day, Choryong was sealed off along its perimeter. The wall was complete. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't uniform. The north and west sides were stone with towers, the south and east sides were earthen earth. The gates were stone, but the perimeter was sealed. For the first time in Choryong's history, the enemy could not simply bypass the wall and enter from the rear. Lee So-yan drew up a defense plan. She knew how the empire waged war, a swift strike, fire, retreat. They don't lay siege, they burn everything to the ground. They come at night. They set fire to everything that burns. They leave before dawn. This tactic doesn't work against stone walls. Stone doesn't burn. But the people inside are burning. The wooden roofs are burning. The supplies are burning. Soyin said, "Well, we need to remove all flammable materials from the walls. Move the wooden structures inside the courtyard toward the center. Cover the roofs with clay. Store supplies in a stone cellar." Jin listened. Then he said, "A granary made of stone, underground with ventilation." Soyeon asked, "Underground?" He said, "Yes." Fire rises. There's no fire underground. Everything of value must be underground. She looked at him. Then she said, "Who taught you to fight?" He said, "No one. I don't fight. I build so that we won't have to fight." He spent 3 days building the underground granary. Everyone dug. The pit was 4 meters deep, 8 meters long, 6 meters wide. He lined the walls with stone blocks. The ceiling was made of fused granite slabs. Together with Ha Yun, he melted the stone for the ceiling inside the pit, where the wind couldn't reach it, and the temperature fluctuations were less severe. The blocks still cracked, but less often, 1 out of 10. Jin used the cracked ones as wall filler. He didn't throw anything away. He set up ventilation through 2 pipes at different heights. Draft. Air enters at the bottom. It exits at the top. The grain doesn't rot. It doesn't get damp. It doesn't get moldy. The locals stored grain in wooden granaries. By spring, 1/3 of it had rotted. Jin told Mira, 0% storage loss. She wrote it down. Then she looked at him. Then she wrote it down again. In bolder letters. On the 85th day, Hannah Kim arrived. She didn't come on her own. She was brought in. A caravan of 12 refugees from the east. They weren't fleeing the ashes. They were fleeing bandits, ravaged villages, looters, deserters from the royal armies who had banded together and were plundering those weaker than themselves. Hannah was among them, 17 years old, thin, silent. Her eyes were open but empty. She didn't speak. Not a word, not a sound. The doctor examined her. Her body was intact. Her throat was intact. She had a voice, but she wouldn't speak. The doctor said, "It's not an illness. It's inside her." Jin had seen her on the first day. She was sitting against the wall of the barracks, staring at a single point. She didn't move. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. Mireille brought her a bowl. She set it down beside her. Hannah didn't touch it. Mireille sat down next to her, silently. An hour later, Hannah picked up the bowl and ate, not because she wanted to eat, because someone was sitting next to her. On the second day, Jin was walking past the barracks. Hannah was sitting in the same spot. He stopped. He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. He took a piece of bread out of his pocket. He placed it next to her. He didn't say anything. He walked on. By evening, the bread was gone. On the 3rd day, he put bread there again. On the 4th day, too. On the 5th day, he placed the bread and a small pebble next to it. Smooth, round, beautiful. He'd found it while digging the foundation. Just a pebble. In the morning, the pebble was in her hand. She was clutching it and looking at it. Jin didn't pester her. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't try to make her talk. He just walked by every day. He left something behind. Bread, an apple, a pebble, a splinter carved into the shape of a bird. A week later, Hannah got up. She went after him, silently, keeping her distance. He was walking toward the wall. She followed him. He was working. She sat nearby and watched. He didn't shoo her away. He paid her no mind. He just worked. She sat there. After 2 weeks, she began handing him his tools. Silently. He held out his hand. She placed the right tool in it. He didn't ask. She knew. She watched him work and memorized everything. Byung-ho said to Jin, "The girl is following you." Jin said, "Let her follow." Byung-ho said, "She doesn't say anything." Jin said, "When she's ready, she'll speak." On the 99th day of winter began to recede, slowly. The temperature rose to -10, then to -5. The snow grew heavy, wet. Droplets tinkled from the roofs. Jin stood on the wall and looked north. Spring was coming, and with it came the enemy. He climbed down and called a council. He said, "We need people. Not just refugees, people who will defend these walls." So Yan said, "The garrison has 12 men. 2 of them are sick. 1 is too old. That leaves 9, really." Wu Jin said, "Men from among the refugees. How many?" Mira opened a book. 38 men between the ages of 16 and 50. 20 of them are fit for duty. The rest are wounded or sick, Wu Jin said. 29 fighters for a wall that requires at least 100, So Yan said. If the wall is sturdy, 50 will be enough, said Wu Jin. The wall is sturdy, but there are only 29 of us. Emily raised her hand. She said, "I can solve this problem." Everyone looked at her. She said, "Rumors about Choryeon vary. Caravan drivers tell stories in the south, a fortress on the border, warm houses, water, food, protection. People don't come here because they have nowhere else to go. They come because it's better here. If I send word along the trade routes, if I say that Choryeon welcomes anyone willing to work and defend, people will come. Men will come." Yudi Jin asked, "How much time?" She said, "A month." Yujin said, "We have a month until spring." She said, "Then I'll start today." Emily wrote letters, 5 of them in 3 languages. She sent them with the caravanners heading south. The letters were simple. Choryeon welcomes people. There is housing. Spring arrived on the 110th day. The snow melted away in a week. The ground was laid bare, wet, black, steaming. The earthen wall began to thaw. First, the joints started to ooze, then the blocks swelled, then the top row on the south side sank 3 centimeters. Wu Jin saw this in the morning and felt a chill, not from fear, out of calculation. He had 2 weeks before the earthen wall would lose its strength. And somewhere to the north, the army of ash was already gathering. With Hayun, he began melting stone at dawn. The spring sun was warm. The temperature difference had decreased. The blocks cracked less often. 1 of 15. Wu Jin assembled stone sections and placed them in place of the thawing earthen ones, section by section, every day. The after effects hit him every evening. He'd lie down and couldn't lift his arm. In the morning, he'd get up and keep going. Hannah brought him water. Silently, she'd set it down beside him. Then she'd leave. She'd return an hour later with food. Mireille noticed this. She told Wu Jin, "You only eat when she brings it." He said, "I forget." She said, "I know, that's why I asked her to bring it." Wu Jin looked at her. She turned away. On the 115th day, So-yeon arrived with news. A scout, a former soldier, had traveled north, a 2-day journey. He'd seen a column, Imperial troops, about 500, infantry, a supply train, no siege equipment in sight. "They're not moving fast. They'll be here in 10 days. Wu Jin listened. 500 against 41. The walls aren't finished yet. The southern section is half earthen. The gate is sturdy, but there's only one. There's no back entrance. If they surround us, there's no way out." He sat down and thought. Then he stood up and walked behind the wall out onto the plain, alone. He stood in the middle of the field, his palms on the ground. He closed his eyes. The soil spoke to him. The loam was soft after winter. The water table had risen. Water was close. 2 meters to the water, the road from the north passes through a narrow passage between the hills. The passage is 100 meters wide, a slope on the right, a ravine on the left. If the enemy is coming along the road, they'll have to pass through this gorge. Wu Jin opened his eyes. He stood up. He looked at the pass, 100 meters. That's a long way for a wall, but not long enough for a trap. He returned to the fortress. He gathered So-yeon and Byung-ho. He said, "We won't wait for them at the walls." So-yeon raised an eyebrow. He said, "We'll meet them on the approach, not in battle." He explained, "The pass is between the hills. It's a narrow spot. If we dig trenches across the road and camouflage them, if we cut into the slope on the right so it crumbles from the vibrations, if we divert water from the aquifer into the low-lying area before the pass and turn the field into a swamp, The army will march along the road, they'll run into the swamp, they'll turn into the pass, they'll fall into the trenches. The slope will crumble, the road will be blocked, they'll get stuck, they won't die, they'll just be stuck. For a day or two, that'll be enough time to finish the wall. So-yeon listened. Her expression changed. Skepticism, interest, respect. She said, "You want to turn a battlefield into a construction site." He said, "I want to turn a construction site into a battlefield. They're different things." She almost smiled. Work began that very day. 20 men went out beyond the wall. They dug trenches. 3 of them, across the road, 1 meter deep, 2 meters wide, deep enough for a horse to break a leg, wide enough to stop the infantry. Byung-ho supervised the camouflage, branches, fabric, a thin layer of soil, invisible from above. So-yeon cut into the slope. She knew how to do it, siege engineering in reverse, not tunneling under the wall, but tunneling under the hill. Remove the support, leave the mass. One jolt and the slope would slide. Woo Jin took care of the water. A water carrier from among the trash soldiers helped. Together they found the channel of an underground stream. Woo Jin skillfully assembled a clay pipe. He brought the water to the surface, into a depression in front of the neck of the slope. The water began to flow, slowly but steadily. After 2 days, the depression became wet. After 5 days, it became a swamp. Shallow, knee-deep, but deep enough for carts to get stuck, for horses to sink, and for infantry in heavy armor to trudge as if through jelly. Woo Jin stood on the hill and looked at his creation. The swamp. Trenches. A cut slope. Not weapons, engineering. He wasn't killing. He was reshaping the land, and the land would work for him. So Ha-eun stood beside him. She said, "That's cowardice." He turned to her. She said, "A real battle is face to face. A wall, fire, a sword, not mud and pits." Woo Jin said, "A real battle is when all my men are alive in the morning." She had nothing to say in reply. She stood there in silence. Then she said softly, "I don't want them to die." He said, "Neither do I." That's why the mud and pits. For the remaining 5 days, he worked non-stop. He replaced the last earthen sections with stone. The southern wall is complete, stone, solid. So-yeon checked every joint, every block, every corner. "It's done," she said. "No," Jin said, "it's not done. We need one more thing." He stepped outside the wall. He found a spot where the soil was especially dense. His palm on the ground, a blueprint in his head, simple, a trench, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep, all the way around the perimeter of the wall. It was his biggest project, not the most complicated, but the most massive, hundreds of metric tons of earth. He didn't have to build it, he had to remove it, dig out the soil, move it to the outer side of the moat, a rampart, a moat and a rampart, basic fortification, something they didn't know about here. Woo Jin closed his eyes, he exhaled and pressed the button. The earth shook, the soil split open, it rose up, it shifted to the sides. The moat cut through the earth around the fortress like a plow furrow. 30 seconds, the longest structure he had ever built. No, taken apart. He had torn the earth apart, piled it into a rampart. The moat stood along the perimeter. 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep, a rampart 1.5 meters high behind it. Woo Jin didn't fall. He collapsed, face first into the ground. He lost consciousness instantly. He woke up 6 hours later. He was lying in his cabin. Hannah was sitting next to him. She was holding a wet cloth to his forehead. When he opened his eyes, she didn't move her hand. She just looked at him, silently. He said, "The moat turned out well." She nodded. She had seen it. On the 125th day, they arrived. In the morning. The sun had barely risen. The sentry in the tower rang the bell. Woo Jin climbed onto the wall. Lee So-yeon was already standing there. She was looking through the spyglass that Emily had bargained for from a caravan driver in exchange for 2 stone blocks. So-yeon said, 400, maybe 450, infantry, light cavalry, 30 horsemen, not much of a supply train. They're traveling light, a quick raid. They've come to burn, not to lay siege." Woo Jin nodded. Everything was just as he'd thought. The column was approaching, black figures against the backdrop of a green spring field. They marched confidently, in formation, experienced. These men had burned cities, dozens of cities. Choryung was just another one to them. The column reached the lowland, the advance guard. 10 horsemen. The first horse stepped into the water. It sank up to its chest. The rider was thrown from the saddle. The second horse reared up. It wheezed. It backed away. The horseman stopped. A swamp. Where did this swamp come from? It wasn't on their maps, because it hadn't been there a month ago. The detachment commander sent out foot scouts. They took a detour, through the narrow pass. The first one sank into a trench. He fell. He screamed. The second one stopped. The third one sank in too. Trenches. Camouflaged. The commander halted the column. He assessed the situation. A swamp on the left. Trenches at the narrow pass. The slope on the right was steep but passable. He sent the unit up the slope, and 30 infantrymen began climbing. Halfway up the slope, the ground gave way. So-yeon had cut the support beam cleanly. A mass of earth shifted, not an avalanche, a landslide, slow, heavy, unstoppable. 30 soldiers tumbled down along with the earth, alive, but waist-deep in mud. Commander Pepla stood on the road and watched. He had lost 10 minutes and 30 soldiers without even starting the battle. Before him lay a swamp, trenches, a landslide, and behind it all a wall, a stone wall, with towers, with archers on the walls, and with fire atop the tower. So Hyun stood on the northern tower, fire in both hands, golden, bright, visible from a kilometer away. She wasn't attacking, she was showing off. Here I am, here's my fire. Come closer. Commander Pepla was assessing the situation. 400 soldiers against a stone fortress with towers, a fortified position, a moat, a swamp, trenches, a fire-bearer on the wall. He'd come to burn a wooden outpost. He'd found a stone fortress. These weren't the kind of casualties he could afford for a single border town. He gave the order. The column turned around, slowly, with difficulty. 30 soldiers spent an hour pulling themselves out of the mud. Then they left. Northward, after the imperial column retreated, Wu Jin didn't celebrate. He was calculating. 450 had come and gone. Next time, there would be 1,000. Or 2, and they would come with siege equipment. The traps had worked once. The second time, the enemy would be prepared. The swamp could be filled in. The trenches could be bypassed. The slope could be bypassed. A fortress stays in one place. The enemy chooses when and from where to attack. That's a losing position. The rules had to change. Wu Jin sat in his hut and thought. Blueprints lay nearby. Dozens of them, walls, towers, gates, moats. All of this is defense, a reaction, a response to someone else's action. But what if we don't respond? What if we act first, not with an attack, by building the city of Namhae, 40 kilometers to the north, burned to the ground, dead, but the stone remains, the foundations remain, the roads remain. If we rebuild Namhae, if we erect walls and houses, if we settle people there, that's not just one fortress. It's two strongholds, a road between them, a supply line. If the enemy marches on Choryong, they leave Namhae in their rear. If they march on Namhae, they leave Choryong. They'll have to attack both. And 2 fortified cities aren't the same as one. That's twice as many walls, twice as many traps, twice as many calculations for the commander. Jin stood up. He went out. He found So-yeon. He said, "I need to go to Namhae." She asked why. He said, "To build." So-yeon was silent. Then she said, "You want to rebuild the burned-down city?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That will take years." He said, "No, it'll take weeks if we have the materials, and in Namhae all the materials are lying on the ground, ready to use, charred. They just haven't been gathered yet." So-yeon looked at him. Then she said, "I'm coming with you." They left 2 days later. Wu Jin, So-yeon, So-ha-yeon, Byung-ho, 10 workers, 2 carts. Emily stayed in Choron. Mireille stayed. The commandant stayed. Hannah stood at the gate and watched them leave. She didn't move, but her fingers were clenching the pebble that Wu Jin had given her on the first day. The journey to Namhai took 3 days. The road was in terrible condition. Ruts, potholes, traces of an army march. Wu Jin looked at her, and his left eye twitched. In a past life, the head of the road service would have been fired for a road like this. Here, there was no such thing as a head of the road service. Roads weren't built in this world. Roads were trails that had been trodden down over the centuries. No one thought about the surface, about drainage, about the foundation, about the width. Wu Jin thought about it, but not now. Now it was Namhai. They saw the city at the end of the 3rd day. Or rather, what was left of it. Namhai had been a city of 3,000 people. It had been. Now it was a pile of ashes, black, dead. The walls had collapsed, the roofs had burned down, the wooden houses had turned into charred skeletons, the stone houses stood without roofs. Empty window sockets, charred beams jutted out like ribs. The smell of smoke lingered even months later. Wu Jin stood at the Namhai gate and said nothing. He'd seen fires at construction sites. He'd seen what you'd built go up in flames, but he'd never seen a place where people lived burned down. This was different. Every charred threshold was a door someone had walked through every evening. Every collapsed ceiling was the sky above someone's bed. Every melted door hinge was a gate that someone had opened every morning. Wu Jin stood there in silence. So Ha-un stood beside him. She wasn't looking at the ruins. She was looking down at her feet. She was a fire-bearer. She knew what fire was capable of. She had seen the results of what her fellow practitioners did, only on the other side. Wu Jin shuddered. He placed his palm on the nearest wall. Stone, soot-stained, cracked from the heat, but stone. He closed his eyes. The stone told him a story. Limestone, soft, porous, set in clay mortar. The masonry was rough. The foundation was shallow. They'd built it quickly and cheaply, but the stone was good. It had withstood the fire. Not all of it, about 70%. The rest had cracked, but cracked stone isn't trash. Cracked stone is filler. It's the base for new mortar. It's material. Jin opened his eyes. He looked at So Ha-un. He said, "I need your fire." She raised her head. He said, "Ashes, ash, charred wood. I need you to burn this down to a powder." "Fine. Uniform." She asked why. He said one word: cement. Ash plus limestone plus water. Pozzolan mortar. The Romans built with it 2,000 years ago. It hardens with water. It's 10 times stronger than clay mortar. It isn't affected by moisture. It doesn't crumble. It doesn't crack. Jin couldn't explain the chemistry of the process to these people. He himself remembered it only vaguely, but he remembered the recipe, the proportions: 3 parts ash to 1 part lime to half a part water. Mix until uniform. Lay it quickly. It sets in a day. It reaches full strength in a week. He remembered because he'd built with it. His grandfather had used a similar mortar on village projects where there was no money for cement. Poverty teaches better than any university. So Ha-un began burning. Piles of charred wood, collapsed beams, coals. She turned them into a fine gray powder with precise, focused heat. Delicate work. She was already used to delicate work. Wu Jin found limestone in the walls, broken blocks, so Yeon and the workers crushed them by hand into powder. Then they mixed it with ash and water. The mortar turned out gray, thick, heavy. Wu Jin took a handful, squeezed it, sniffed it, placed it on a stone. After a day, the mortar had hardened. Strong. Waterproof. The stone couldn't be pried loose. Wu Jin stood over this lump of hardened mortar and felt a smile spread across his face. Cement, in a world where it didn't exist, made from the ashes of his enemies. So Yeon approached. She touched it, tapped it, tried to chip a piece off. She couldn't. She looked at Wu Jin, then she said, "This will change everything." He nodded. "This will change everything." Over the next 3 weeks, Wu Jin rebuilt the central district of Namhai. 20 houses, walls made of old stone set in fresh mortar, roofs made of wood that Byung-ho had cut down in the nearby forest, stoves with chimneys, ondol, a well. Woo Jin assembled them with his skill and finished them by hand. He assembled each house in 10 to 15 seconds, the frame, the walls, roof. Then he'd finish them off by hand, doors, windows, stoves, little details that his skill couldn't handle because they were too specific to each house. He was getting more and more exhausted. By the end of the second week, he was collapsing after every third house, so Yeon made him take 2 days off. He was angry. She said, "If you collapse and don't get back up, who's going to finish building it?" He fell silent. She was right. On the 18th day, the first residents arrived in Namhae, not refugees, those who had lived there before, 12 people. They had fled south when the city was burning. They had been wandering for 3 months. They heard from caravan drivers that someone was rebuilding their city. They didn't believe it. They came to see for themselves. The old man walked ahead. Work in Namhae continued. Woo Jin rebuilt one neighborhood after another. By the end of the 4th month, 40 houses stood, then 50, then 60. People were returning 2 or 3 at a time, former residents who recognized their homes, new refugees who needed a roof over their heads. By the end of the 5th month, 200 people were living in Namhae. Woo Jin was torn between the two towns, a week in Namhae, a week in Koryon. The journey between them took 3 days, 6 days out of 14 spent on the road. It was impossible. He needed a road, a proper one, straight, with a solid surface, so it would take 2 days instead of 3. So the cart wouldn't get stuck in every rut. Woo Jin stood halfway between the cities and looked at the trail they called a road. Mud, ruts, puddles, tree roots crisscrossing the path, rocks, potholes. This isn't a road, it's a direction. He sat down by the side of the road and began to think. Roman roads, 3 layers, a base of large stones, a middle layer of crushed stone, a top layer of compacted gravel, drainage on the sides, a convex profile so the water would run off. 3 meters wide for two-way traffic. He knew how to build roads. In his past life, it hadn't been his specialty, but he'd worked on road projects twice. And he knew the basics. The problem was the scale. 40 kilometers. This isn't a house, not a wall, not a ditch. It's a line 40,000 meters long. Even if he built 100 meters a day using his skill, it would take him 400 days, more than a year. He couldn't wait a year, but he could do it differently, not the entire road using his skill. Skill for the complex parts, hands for the simple ones. The base could be laid by hand, stones along the 4 drainage by hand, and the top layer with the machine. Tamp down the gravel, level it, compact it. It's a simple operation. Flat, linear, minimal complex calculations, meaning minimal setbacks. He could cover a kilometer a day if the foundation was already ready. He needed people to lay the foundation, lots of people. He returned to Chorryong. He spoke with Emily. She said, "A road is trade, trade is money. Money is food and iron and cloth. I'll find people." And she did, through the caravan drivers, through the trade connections she'd been building for 3 months. 30 workers from the southern kingdom, not refugees, mercenaries. They worked for pay. Their pay was stone blocks. With Haun, she smelted them by the dozen. The blocks went south. The workers came from the south. Barter. Emily managed the flow. She blossomed. Jin saw her changing. The mask of the cheerful chatterbox hadn't disappeared, but something genuine had emerged behind it. A sense of purpose, a goal. She wasn't just working. She was building a trade network. Stone blocks from Choryon went south. Iron went north. Cloth went north. Grain went north. Seeds went north. Tools were heading north. And information was flowing both ways. Emily knew the prices of iron in the 3 kingdoms. She knew where there was a bountiful harvest and where there was drought. She knew which baron was looking for builders and which king was seeking allies. She had become Koryon's eyes and ears. The road was being built. Slowly, the workers laid the foundation, kilometer by kilometer. Woo Jin followed behind and laid the top layer with practiced ease. Palm on the gravel. Click. 100 meters of smooth, compacted surface, minimal rollback, a slight dizziness, the next section in a minute. He covered a kilometer a day, sometimes a kilometer and a half. By the end of the 6th month, a third of the road was complete, 14 kilometers, straight, level, with drainage. The first cart traveled along it in 4 hours instead of a day and a half. The caravan driver who was leading it stopped halfway. He got off, kneeled down, ran his hand over the surface, level, smooth, firm. He'd been traveling this route for 10 years. Every time he'd break a wheel. Every time he'd lose a day to repairs. Every time he'd curse this road. Now there was no road. There was pavement. He stood up, got into the cart, and drove off. Mireille was waiting in Chor-Yan with news. Bad news. A messenger had arrived from the capital, a royal decree. The commander of Chor-Yan was summoned to the capital to report. Yun De-ho was supposed to go. He didn't want to, but a decree is a decree. Mireille stood at the gate and watched as her father saddled his horse. Her face was stony. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry when she was 15. The commander hugged his daughter. Then he approached Wu Jin. He said, "Take care of them." Wu Jin nodded. The commander rode off. Mireille went back inside. She sat down at the table. She opened a book. She began to count. As always, Wu Jin stood in the doorway and watched her. Then he came in. He sat down across from her. He said, "He'll come back." She didn't look up. She said, "Mother left too." Wu Jin fell silent. Then he said, "I'll build him a road to the capital, so he can come back faster." She looked up. She looked at him. Her eyes were red, dry. She said, "You can't build a road to the capital." He said, "I can build anything. It's just a matter of time." She looked at him. Then she lowered her eyes. And for the first time in 10 years, a single tear fell onto the page of her book, right onto the column of expenses. She quickly wiped it away and continued counting. Wu Jin stood up and left. Hannah was standing on the porch. She had heard everything. She handed him a mug of water. He took it. He drank it. She took the mug and left, silently, as always. The next day, Wu Jin continued working on the road. Now he worked harder, faster, 2 kilometers a day. The kickback was growing, but he endured it. So-yeon noticed. She said, "You're going to kill yourself." He said, "I won't." She said, "I've seen people who said that. Then I saw their graves." He stopped. He looked at her. She was standing in front of him. Her left hand was scarred. Her eyes were calm, steady. She said, "You're not alone. Stop acting like you're alone." He was silent. Then he nodded. She was right. The road was finished on the 160th day, 40 kilometers, straight, smooth, paved, with drainage. With stone posts every kilometer, from Chor-Yan to Namhai in a single day. Not 3, just 1. Emily personally led the first convoy along the new road, 10 wagons full, grain, iron, tools, cloth, and people. 20 new settlers. They rode along the road and couldn't believe their eyes. Level, smooth, not a single rut, not a single pothole. There was no road like this in any of the 7 kingdoms. Emily stood on the first wagon and smiled, a genuine smile. She said, "You know, this road is worth more than all of Chor-Yan." Wu Jin said, "A road is worth as much as time is worth." She laughed. That evening she came to him, serious, without a mask. She said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. She said, "I didn't end up in that caravan by accident. I was running away, my family, my father. He sold my business contacts to a competitor. Everything I'd built up over 3 years, my network, my people. He sold it because I'm a daughter, not a son. A daughter doesn't inherit the business. A daughter gets married. A daughter has children. A daughter keeps quiet. I didn't keep quiet. He said I wasn't his daughter anymore. I boarded a ship. I ended up on a caravan. The caravan was burned down. I was left behind." She fell silent. Then she said, "I'm telling you this because you've never once asked why I'm here. Not once. You just said, 'Find me some metal.' And I found it. And for the first time in a year, I felt needed. Not because I smile, but because I'm capable. Jin listened. Then he said, "A room." She blinked. He said, "I'll build you a room, not a workroom, just a room, with a window, without a desk. You don't need to do anything in it, just live." Emily looked at him. Then she turned and walked away. Quickly. He didn't see her face, but he saw her raise her hand to her eyes. He built the room the next day, a small one, with a large south-facing window, with a wooden floor, with a shelf for her things, not a single desk, not a single chair for working, just a bed, a window, a shelf, a place to live, not for practical use. Emily hadn't gone in there for 2 weeks. He didn't ask Jin. On the 15th day, Mi-rae said, "She's in there, sleeping." Jin nodded and went to build the 6th month. Choryong and Namhae were living. They weren't just surviving, they were living. There were 400 people in Choryong, 250 in Namhae. The road between them was busy. Carts traveled every day. Goods, people, letters. Woo Jin watched this and thought about how, 6 months ago, he had been lying on the rocks, not knowing where he was. Now he had 2 cities. The road, the walls, the people, and problems that were growing faster than the walls. The first problem, the academy. The commandant had left for the capital a month ago and hadn't returned. Mi-rae didn't show any concern, but Woo Jin saw how she climbed the wall every morning and looked south. Instead of the commandant, a letter arrived. Not from him, from the royal court chancellery. Dry, formal. "The commandant has been detained for questioning, on suspicion of misusing the crown's resources, on suspicion of harboring a person expelled from the 5 Towers Academy, on suspicion of colluding with the aforementioned person, the person expelled from the academy. It's him, Kang Woo Jin." Mi-rae read the letter aloud. Her voice didn't waver. She read it through to the end. She folded the paper. She placed it on the table. Then she said, "This is Hwang Taemin." Woo Jin looked up. Mi-rae said, "The academy's master, the one who signed your expulsion. He's from an old royal family. He has connections at court. He found out what you're up to, and he's afraid." Woo Jin asked, "What is he afraid of?" Mi-rae looked at him, and for the first time ever she smiled, not a joyful smile, but a bitter one. She said, You're living proof that he was wrong, that his entire system is wrong, that a trash skill can be more important than a combat skill. If you're right, then he's been casting people aside for nothing his whole life. He can't let that happen." Woo Jin was silent. Then he said, "I don't care about the academy. I need your father to come back." Mi-rae said, "For that to happen, the court needs to see it, not hear it. See it. Words are dust. A stone is a stone." Woo Jin thought for a moment. Then he nodded. He said, "Let them come. Let them watch. I won't hide. I'll keep building." Emily said, "I can arrange it, a visit, an inspection, but not from the court. From merchants, the Southern Kingdom's Chamber of Commerce. They're neutral. Their word carries weight with any court because money backs their word. If they see Choryong and Namhae and the road, if they write a report, the court won't be able to ignore it." Woo Jin said, "Go ahead." The second problem, Hannah. She was still silent, 3 months by his side. Not a word, not a sound. She worked. She handed him tools. She carried water. She brought him food. She made sure he ate, slept, and drank. But she didn't speak. The doctor told Woo Jin, "She has a voice. Her body is healthy, but something inside is locked away, like a door that's jammed." Woo Jin listened. Then he said, "I'll build her a house." The doctor asked, "A house?" he said. "A small one, next to mine, with a bell on the door, so I'll know when she's come." He built it in a day, tiny. 1 room, a bed, a window facing east, a shelf, and a bell on the door, small, made of copper. The blacksmith cast it at Woo Jin's request. When the door opens, the bell rings, softly, gently. Woo Jin showed Hannah the house. She stood in the doorway and looked around. Then she went inside. She touched the walls, the bed, the shelf. Then she opened the door. The bell tinkled. She froze. She opened the door again. It tinkled again. She looked at Wu Jin. He said, "It's so I'll know you're here." She stood in the doorway. Then she closed the door. From the inside, Wu Jin left. The third problem, Park Jia. But Wu Jin didn't know yet that this was a problem. He knew her as Song Yuri, the cook. She'd arrived in Cheorwan 2 months ago with a group of refugees, quiet, plain-looking, her hair hidden under a headscarf. Her hands were rough. Her face was plain. She said she knew how to cook. Mireille assigned her to the communal barracks kitchen. Song Yuri cooked. Well, very well. Porridge made from the same grain turned out different when she made it. Soup made from the same vegetables had flavor when she made it. Bread made from the same flour rose higher when she baked it. People noticed. They started coming to see her, not just to eat, to talk. She listened. She nodded. Sometimes she said something quiet and to the point, and the person would leave feeling calmer than when they'd arrived. Wu Jin noticed her by chance. He walked into the barracks for lunch. Sun Yuri was standing by the pot. She saw him. She poured a bowl. She handed it to him. He took a bite. He paused. He tried it again. He looked at her. He said, "This is the best food I've ever eaten in this world." She smiled just a little. She said, "The secret is that I fry the onions until they're golden, not brown." Wu Jin nodded, as if that explained everything. He didn't notice that she'd said it in a pure capital dialect, one a refugee from the countryside couldn't possibly know. But Mireille noticed, and she made a note of it. Sun Yuri, capital dialect, knows how to cook fancy dishes. Her hands are rough, but her nails are neat. She keeps her back straight even when kneading dough. Habit, upbringing, not from the village. Mireille didn't say anything. She just watched. The fourth problem, with Ha-un. She had changed over the past 6 months. She hadn't become gentler. She hadn't become kinder. But she had become different. She no longer said that a fire-bearer shouldn't melt stone. She melted stone every day. She fired clay. She dried peat. She tempered metal for the blacksmith. Her fire, which had been created to kill, heated the furnaces, melted stone, and fired bricks. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She didn't admit out loud that Wu Jin was right. But she worked. And one evening, Wu Jin saw her standing by the wall, looking out at the city, at the houses she had helped build, at the smoke rising from the furnaces she had fired, at the walls made of the stone she had melted. Her face looked strange, not angry, not proud, confused, like someone looking at themselves in a mirror and not recognizing who they are. Wu Jin approached. He stood beside her. He said, "I've wanted to do something for you for a long time." She turned toward him, wary. He said, "Let's go." He led her to an outbuilding by the north wall, a small stone structure he'd built 2 days earlier. He hadn't told anyone why, so Ha-un went inside. Inside was a stone hearth, large and deep, with thick walls that could withstand any heat. The ceiling was high and made of stone. The chimney was wide. The walls were lined with fireproof clay. The floor was stone. Not a single wooden detail. Nothing that could burn. So Ha-un stood in the middle of the room and looked around. Then she understood. It was a workshop. For her. A place where she could use her fire to its fullest, without fear of burning anything, without holding back, without controlling every degree. Here she could simply burn and destroy nothing, because she's surrounded by stone, because there's nothing here to burn. Wu Jin said, "Try it." She raised her hands. Fire flared up, not the neat, precise fire she used to melt stone and fire clay, the real thing, full, roaring. A golden flame filled the hearth. It struck the walls. It bounced off. The walls held. The ceiling held. The exhaust vent absorbed the heat and carried it upward. The room filled with golden light, warm, alive. So Ha-un stood in the center of her fire and looked at her hands. For the first time in her life, she was burning not to kill, not to melt, not to scorch. She was burning because she could, because it was hers, and nothing around her was burning, nothing was being destroyed. The stone stood firm, the walls held, the fire was at home. She lowered her hands. The fire went out. She stood in silence in the dark stone workshop. Then she slowly sat down on the floor, crossed her legs, rested her hands on her knees, and didn't leave that spot for a full day. Mi Rei asked Wu Jin. "Is she all right?" Wu Jin said, "Yes, she's just found her place." On the 181st day, a delegation from the Southern Kingdom's Chamber of Commerce arrived in Kaoryong. 6 people, 4 merchants, 1 clerk, 1 guard. Emily met them at the gate, a smile, a handshake, 4 languages. She spoke to them as if they were her own, because they were her own. The daughter of the trade envoy knew exactly how to talk to money. She showed them around Kaoryong, the walls, the towers, the barracks, the well, the pump, the underground grain storage, ondal, blacksmith's shop, workshop, road. The merchants were silent. The clerk took notes. The senior merchant, named Moon Sang-ho, walked ahead, touching everything: walls, stone, mortar, road surface. He had been a merchant for 30 years. He knew the value of every material, and he couldn't put a price on what he saw: a wall of fused granite. Such stone cost as much as silver per metric ton. There were thousands of metric tons of it here. A paved road. No kingdom had a road like this. Even 100 private roads were unpaved. A ventilated underground storage facility. He'd traded grain for 20 years and knew that a third of the harvest was lost during storage. Here, there was 0 loss. He stopped in the middle of the courtyard. He looked at Emily. He asked, "Who built this?" Emily said, "One man." Moon Sang-ho asked, "Where is he?" Jin was standing on the wall, patching a crack in the top row, with his hands, without any skill, mortar, a trowel, dirty hands, a wet shirt. He didn't know that standing below was a man who could buy half the Southern Kingdom. Emily called him. He came down, wiped his hands on his pants, looked at the merchants, nodded. Moon Sang-ho stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "I was told you were expelled from the academy for being useless." Wu Jin said, "Yes," Moon Sang-ho said. "I want to see it." Wu Jin looked at the pile of stones by the wall. Construction debris, scraps, broken blocks, his palm on the stone, his eyes closed. A sketch, simple, a bench. Made of stone, with a smooth surface, with legs, with armrests. 3 seconds. The stones came together. The bench appeared in front of the merchants, even, smooth, perfect. Moon Sang-ho sat down on it. He ran his hand over the surface, smooth as if polished. He stood up, looked at Wu Jin, then at the bench. Then he said, "How much do you want to build for me?" Wu Jin said, "I don't build for people, I build for people." Moon Sang-ho didn't understand, Emily translated. He's not a hired builder. He builds for those who need a roof over their heads, not for those who need a palace. Moon Sang-ho was silent. Then he said, "I'll write a report. In a week, every settlement on the continent will receive it, including yours." Moon Sang-ho left with the caravan 3 days later. Emily read the draft before it was sent. She came to Wu Jin that evening and said, "He wrote that Choryong is the most significant settlement outside the capitals. He wrote that the road between Choryong and Namhae is unparalleled. He wrote that a builder named Kang Wu Jin is of greater strategic interest than any battle mage." Wu Jin said, "This will help bring the commandant back." Emily said, "It will do more than that. It will make you a target." She was right. 3 weeks after the report was sent, news arrived. 3 pieces of news. First, Commander Yoon Dae-ho has been released and is on his way home. The charges have been dropped. The Chamber of Commerce intervened. Money speaks louder than the magistrates. Second, the neighboring kingdom of Kimsun has sent an envoy with a proposal, an official one. They want Wu Jin to build a road from their border to Choryong for a fee, a large fee. Third, Master Huang Tai-Mian has personally set out for the south. He's heading to Choryong with a detachment of 20 academy fighters. So Yan brought this news. Her face was stern. She said, 20 academy fighters are not guards. They're a combat unit. He's not going there to talk. Wu Jin asked what he could do. 20 fighters against the walls of Choryong, so Yan said he wouldn't attack the walls. He's a master. He has the royal right of confiscation. Any skill deemed dangerous to the crown may be confiscated, along with the bearer. Wu Jin asked, confiscated? So Yan said, arrest, transport to the academy, a magistrate's trial, imprisonment, or execution. Wu Jin remained silent. Then he said, my skill is considered trash. How can it be both trash and dangerous at the same time? So Yeon said, for Huang Tai-Mian, this isn't a contradiction. It's a necessity. If you're trash, then the system is right. If you're dangerous, then the system will eliminate you. Either way, he's right. That's his logic. So Hae-Eun stood by the wall and listened. She said, let him come. I'll meet him. Wu Jin shook his head. No, not like that, he said. If we attack them, we're criminals. If we don't let them in, we're rebels. If we let them in and he invokes the right of seizure, I'll be in chains. So Yan said, there's a fourth option. Wu Jin looked at her. She said, the right of seizure applies within the crown's territory if Choryong isn't part of the crown's territory. Wu Jin said, Choryong is a border fortress of the crown. So Yan said, it used to be. Back when the old wall stood here, back when 12 soldiers lived here, back when there was nothing here. Now there's a city here, 400 people, the walls you built, the road you built, the granary you built. Not a single stone here was laid by the crown. Everything was built by you, with materials you found, by the hands of the people who came to you. You feed these people, you protect these people. The crown hasn't invested a single coin here in 7 years. According to the laws of Hyoryeon, if a territory has been abandoned by the crown for 5 years or more and restored by a private individual, that person has the right to file a petition for self-governance. Wu Jin looked at her. She said, I read these laws while I was building siege engines. Siege engineers know the laws of fortresses better than lawyers. Emily jumped to her feet. Her eyes were ablaze. She said, a petition for self-governance. That means Huang Tai-Mian won't be able to exercise the right of expropriation because this isn't crown territory. So Yun nodded. But the petition must be filed before he arrives, and it must be accepted by at least one sovereign entity. Emily said, Moon Sang-ho. The Chamber of Commerce has the authority to certify petitions for self-governance in territories outside its jurisdiction. It's an old law for trading posts, but it's still in effect, Wu Jin said. How much time do we have? So Yan said. 10 days, Emily said. I need 5. Emily worked for 4 days. She didn't sleep. She wrote, she rewrote, she calculated, she drafted a petition for self-governance in 3 languages. With a description of the territory, with a list of buildings, with a roll call of residents, with trade balances, with evidence that the crown hadn't invested in Choryong for at least 7 years. The document was as thick as a fist. So Yan checked the legal aspects. Mireille checked the figures. Wu Jin checked the list of buildings. Everything added up. Emily sent the document by courier to Moon Sang-ho, by the fastest courier, on the best horse, along the road that Wu Jin had built. The courier reached the trading post in 2 days. Moon Sang-ho read it. He affixed his seal. The Chamber of Commerce of the Southern Kingdom had certified Choryong's petition for self-governance. On the 6th day, the courier returned with the seal and the document. Emily held it in her hands, and for the first time in half a year, her fingers trembled, not out of fear, but because of the significance of the moment. This was not just a document, it was a birth. On the 8th day, the commandant arrived. Yoon Dae-ho rode on horseback, alone, thin, aged. A month in the capital's prison had left its mark on him, but he rode along a road that hadn't existed when he left. Along a flat, smooth, paved road. He stopped his horse in the middle of the road. He dismounted. He stepped onto the pavement. He touched it with his foot. Then he sat down on the shoulder and remained there for 10 minutes. Then he rode on. Mireille met him at the gate. She didn't rush toward him. She didn't cry out. She stood upright, the book pressed to her chest, her back straight. The commandant dismounted. He approached. He embraced his daughter. She stood in his arms like a stone pillar. 5 seconds. Then she hugged him back, tightly, silently. Then she let go. She straightened up, opened the book, said, "You need to know what's happened over the past month." He laughed for the first time in a month. On the 10th day, Huang Taimin arrived. Jin stood on the wall and watched. A column of 20 horsemen in the uniforms of the 5 Towers Academy. Red cloaks, silver clasps. At the front rode a man on a black horse. Tall, upright, white hair, a narrow face, handsome, cold. The face of a man who had never doubted himself. Huang Taimin, master of the academy, the man who had signed off on Kong Wu Jin's expulsion for a worthless skill. He stopped in front of the gates and looked up, at the walls, at the towers, at the moat. His expression didn't change. No surprise, no fear, no respect. He saw the walls. He saw the stone, but he didn't see what everyone else saw. He saw a threat. So-yeon stood next to Wu Jin. She said quietly. He hadn't expected this. Wu Jin said, "Why?" So-yeon said, "Because to him, you're still just a trash collector." He had imagined a wooden fence, not a fortress. Wu Jin went downstairs. He walked out to the gate. He opened it himself. Huang Taimin rode into the courtyard. He dismounted. His 20 fighters remained in the saddles. He looked around, the courtyard, the houses, the people, the children, smoke from the chimneys, the smell of food, life. He turned to Wu Jin. He looked down at him. He was a head taller. He said, "Kang Wu Jin, a packer, exiled for being useless." Wu Jin said, "Yes." Huang Taimin said, "I have the right of royal requisition. Your skill has been deemed a potential threat to the order of the crown. You will come with me to the academy for a magistrate's trial." Wu Jin did not reply. He took out a scroll. He handed it to the magistrate. Huang Taimin took it. He unrolled it. He read it. His expression changed slowly. A petition for self-governance. Certified by the Chamber of Commerce. With a complete list, with a seal, with evidence. The territory of Korean does not belong to the crown. The right of expropriation does not apply. Huang Taimin read for a long time. Then he rolled up the scroll. He looked at Wu Jin. His face was calm, but something dark thing was burning. He said, "Paper," Wu Jin said. "Stone," he pointed to the walls. Huang Taimin was silent. Then he said, "This won't end with paper. You understand that?" Wu Jin said, "I understand." Huang Taimin mounted his horse. His 20 fighters turned around. They rode away in silence. So Ha-Yun stood on the tower. Fire smoldered in her palms. She extinguished it only when the last rider had disappeared over the horizon. That evening, they all sat down together. Wu Jin, So-yeon, So Ha-Yun, Emily, Mireille, the commandant, Byung-ho, and Song Yuri, the cook, who brought dinner and stayed. So-yeon said, "He'll be back, not alone. He'll bring an army, or he'll set the empire against us, or both." Mireille said, "How much time do we have?" So-yeon said, 3 months, maybe 4. He needs to return to the capital, convince the court, gather his forces. That won't happen quickly. Wu Jin said, 3 months. He looked out the window, at the walls, at the towers, at the road leading north. Then he said, "I need more cities." Everyone looked at him. He said, "You can destroy 1 city, you can destroy 2 cities. You can't destroy 5 cities, 10 cities. Those aren't just cities anymore. That's a country." He stood up and walked over to where a map hung. A rough one, drawn by hand, by So-yeon, Cho-ryong, Nam-hai, the road between them. He pointed his finger at 3 spots. Here, here, and here. 3 burned-down villages between Nam-hai and the next line of the imperial advance, abandoned, dead. But with stone, with foundations, with building materials. He said, 3 months, 3 cities, roads between them, walls, houses, people, a line of defense, not just 1 fortress, a chain. So Yan said, "That's impossible in 3 months." Woo-jin looked at her, then at everyone in the room. Then he said, "6 months ago I was lying on the rocks and didn't know where I was. Look where we are now." Silence. Then Byung-ho stood up, limping. "It's hard," he said. "I'll go first, wherever you say." So Ha-eun stood up. She said, "I need more stone. Show me where." Emily stood up. She said, "I need caravans. Give me a week." So Yan stood up. She said, "I need blueprints for all 3 cities. Tonight." Mirai didn't get up. She was already counting. The next 3 months were the hardest of Woo-jin's life. In both lives, he worked 20 hours a day, slept 4, ate when Hannah put a bowl in front of him, drew blueprints, built, collapsed from exhaustion. He'd get up and build again. The first city, Songwon, a former village at a crossroads 20 kilometers northeast of Namhae, burned down 3 months ago. Stone foundations, a stream nearby, good soil, bedrock 5 meters down. Woo-jin arrived with a crew of 30 workers. So Ha-eun quarried the stone, so Yan designed the walls. Woo-jin assembled everything. House after house, wall after wall, a well, stoves, ondol, a granary, all according to a tried and true plan. 10 days, 20 houses, a perimeter wall, water, heat. The road from Songwon to Namhae, 20 kilometers. He laid the pavement in a week. The backfill was killing him. Every evening he lay face down on the ground, unable to move a finger. So Yan had forbidden him to work twice. He didn't listen. The third time, she stood between him and the stone and said, "If you die, who will finish building these cities?" He stopped. He took a day off. He lay in the tent and stared at the ceiling. Hannah sat at the entrance, silently. She had come with him. She went everywhere with him. The second city, Talmok, a former lumberjack settlement 30 kilometers west of Nami. At the foot of the mountains, the forest nearby, stone nearby, water from a mountain stream. The perfect spot. With Jin, he built it faster. He'd gained experience. The plans were well rehearsed. With Ha-eun, he worked without instructions. She knew which blocks were needed, what size, what shape. She shaped the stone as naturally as she breathed, precisely, smoothly, without a single crack. She didn't notice when she stopped considering this work beneath her. She just stopped. Talmok was built in 12 days, 25 houses, a wall, a sawmill. Woo-jin used his skills to assemble the simplest sawing machine. A water wheel in the stream turns the shaft. The shaft turns the saw. The wood is fed by hand. Rough. Primitive. But a log that would take 1 person a day to saw, the machine could cut in an hour. The locals stood around and looked at the machine as if it were a miracle. For them, it was a miracle. For Woo-jin, it was 16th century technology. But for this world, the 16th century was the future. The third city, Hansai, the largest of the 3, a former trading hub 40 kilometers north of Namhae. The closest to the empire's front line, the most dangerous, the most important. Woo-jin built it last, and he built it differently. Hansai was not just a city. Hansai was a fortress, a trap. He spent a month designing it. He sketched every night. So Yan sat beside him, checking his work, arguing, suggesting. They worked together like 2 engineers, 1 military, 1 civilian. She knew how things were broken. He knew how to build them. Together, they built it so it couldn't be broken. Hansai had 3 rings of walls, outer, middle, inner. Streets ran between them. But the streets weren't just streets. They were canals, traps, a labyrinth. If the enemy breached the outer wall, they would find themselves on a street leading not to the center but to a dead end. The walls would shift. The passageways would close, squares would collapse into basements, houses would become bastions. Woo-jin had built a mechanism into the city's structure, not a magical one, an engineering one, levers, counterweights, locks, stone blocks on iron hinges. The blacksmith had spent a week forging the hinges. Woo-jin assembled each mechanism separately. He tested each one, he fine-tuned each one. The backlash from Hansei was monstrous. Ujin collapsed after every section. He lost consciousness. He came to. He kept going. On the 20th day of Hansei's construction, he lost consciousness for 6 hours. So Yeon picked him up, carried him to the tent. When he woke up, she was sitting next to him. Her good hand was resting on his forehead. She moved her hand away when he opened his eyes. She said, "You're an idiot." He said, "3 more sections." She said, "Tomorrow." He said, "Today." She didn't argue. She knew it was pointless. Hansei was completed on the 260th day. 3 rings of walls, 100 houses, a square, wells, granaries, a sawmill, a smithy, and a trap. A trap city. A city that could close in on the enemy like a fist. Jin stood on Hansei's central tower and looked north. He was thin, exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. His hands trembled constantly. He had pushed himself to the very limit, but 5 cities stood. Chorryong, Namhae, Seongwon, Talmok, Onse, the roads between them, the walls, the houses, the people, the line stretching from the border fortress to the front line. 1,200 people. Not refugees. Residents. That evening, Song Yuri brought him dinner to his tent. She entered quietly. She set down the bowl. He ate. She sat beside him. Then she said, "You'll die if you keep this up." He said, "I won't die." She said, "I've seen people die of exhaustion. Kings and beggars die the same way." Ujin raised his head. He looked at her. She said it calmly, not like a cook, but like someone who had seen kings die. He said, "Who are you?" She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Park Ji-ah, the 3rd princess of the kingdom of Cheonga." He chewed, swallowed, said, "The soup's still delicious." She blinked. Then she laughed, quietly, truly. He said, "Why are you here?" She explained, "A political marriage. The old king from the neighboring kingdom. She's 26, he's 60. She ran away, under a false name, with a caravan, lost everything, found Keoryong." She said, "I've been watching you for 6 months. You're the only person I've ever met who builds not for himself. Every king builds a palace. Every baron builds a castle. You build barracks for refugees and roads for carts," Jin said. "Roads are more important than palaces." She said, "I know. That's why I'm here." He finished his soup, looked at her, then said, "I need someone who understands how power works. I build cities, but I don't know how to govern them. I don't know the laws. I don't know the protocols. I don't know who to write to, so they don't burn us. You're a princess, you know that." She looked at him. Then she said, "You're offering me a job." He said, "I'm offering you a position, just like everyone else." She was silent. Then she said, "Then build me a bookshelf." He built her a bookshelf the next day in her room, which had previously been a corner of the kitchen with a curtain. Now it was a room, with a bookshelf, with a window, with a bed. G.A. stood in front of the bookshelf and touched the wood. Smooth, warm, a bookshelf for books, not for reports, not for decrees, for the books she wants to read. She turned to Wu Jin. She said, "For the first time I wasn't seen as a princess." He said, "Well, you haven't been a princess for the last 6 months. You were a cook, and a good one." She smiled, widely, without calculation, without a mask. On the 271st day, the notebook appeared. Wu Jin found it in the pocket of the jacket he'd been wearing since day 1. He put on that jacket every morning. The pocket was empty, always. But on that day, he reached in and felt a piece of paper, a notebook, small, worn, with yellowed pages. He opened it and his hands froze. Korean, Hangul, handwritten, an old man's handwriting. Fine, neat, his grandfather's handwriting. Wu Jin recognized it instantly. His grandfather wrote all his estimates that way, all his reports, all his notes, fine, even, not a single smudge. Jin sat down on the ground right where he was standing, in the middle of the courtyard, and began to read. Grandfather had written, A world with two moons. I've been seeing it in my dreams since I was 12. Every night, the same place. Rocky ground, two moons, a wall. I wake up and draw. Walls, houses, roads. I don't know where these drawings come from. They come to me in my dreams. I build according to them in my life. Foundations down to the bedrock, drainage, ventilation. I used to think these were my ideas. Now I think they're not mine. Jin turned the page. Grandpa kept writing. I'm 40. The dreams have become clearer. I see more than just a place. I see people. They speak a language I don't know. They're building, purely, stone on sand, wood without a foundation. I scream in my sleep. Not like that. Don't put it that way. They can't hear me. I wake up in a sweat. My wife says I mumble in my sleep. I mumble words that don't exist in Korean. Another page. I'm 55. I found something, an old book in a used bookstore in Busan. There are two circles on the cover, two moons. Inside is text in a language that doesn't exist, but I read it. In my sleep. The book is calling, not me. Someone of my blood, a builder. A world with two moons awaits a builder. The lighthouse is lit. Whoever comes must know one thing. Don't gather too quickly. The world cannot withstand it. Jin read that line 3 times. Don't gather too quickly. The world cannot withstand it. What does that mean? The last page. My grandfather's handwriting. Uneven. Shaky. He wrote this shortly before his death. I'm 72. The dreams have stopped. The lighthouse no longer shines for me. I'm too old, but it will shine for someone of my blood, for a son or for a grandson. The notebook will reveal itself when the time comes, when the builder is ready. One warning. The second moon isn't a moon. It's an object, unfinished, abandoned. Someone started building this world and didn't finish it. The world stands on an unfinished foundation. If you build too much, too fast, on too grand a scale, the foundation won't hold. The world will crack, like a house without a foundation. Jin closed the notebook. He sat on the ground. He looked at the two moons. One was pale, the other was reddish. Huge, not a moon, an object. The world of Hae-ryong is a construction site, unfinished, abandoned, and he's building inside someone else's construction site, on someone else's foundation, which might not hold. He stood up. His legs wouldn't hold him, his palm on the ground. He could feel it, deep down, beneath the soil, beneath the clay, beneath the bedrock, something else, a structure, not natural, artificial, smooth lines, right angles, like a building's foundation. Beneath the entire continent, Hae-ryong's world stands on that foundation. Someone laid it, someone started building, and abandoned it, left the world on an unfinished foundation, and that foundation is cracking. Jin could feel the cracks, small ones, deep ones. They radiated out from the places where he had built the most, from Choryong, from Namhae, from Hans. His construction was putting pressure on the unfinished foundation, and the foundation was responding. With cracks, don't build too fast. He understood what the warning meant. He understood why his predecessor had gone mad. The one who came before him had also been building, just as quickly, just as much, and he'd felt the world cracking beneath his hands, and he couldn't bear that knowledge. Because he was alone. Jin stood in the middle of the courtyard and breathed. Then he looked around. So-yeon was drawing by the wall. So-ha-eun was melting stone behind the wall. Emily was counting with the caravan driver. Mireille was taking notes. Byung-ho was hauling logs. Hannah was sitting by the door of his hut, waiting. Jia was carrying hot soup to someone. The commandant was standing on the wall, looking north. He wasn't alone. His predecessor had been alone. Jin wasn't. He clenched the notebook and tucked it into his pocket. Then he went to So-yeon. He said, I need to talk. To you. To everyone. That evening, they sat together. All of them. Jin placed the notebook on the table. He told them everything. His past life, his death, his awakening, his grandfather's notebook, the unfinished foundation of the world, the second moon, the cracks. There was a long silence. So-yeon spoke first. She said, That explains why you know things that no one else in this world knows. Wu Jin nodded, so Ha-yun said, I don't care where you're from. What matters to me is that you're here. Emily said, 2 worlds, 2 markets. I need to think. Jia said, if the world stands on an unfinished foundation, then the foundation needs to be finished. Wu Jin looked at her. She said, you're a builder. You don't build on a bad foundation. You repair the foundation and then build. Mira said, how long will it take to repair the foundation of the world? Wu Jin said, I don't know. I don't even know where to start. Hannah sat in the corner. She didn't speak, but she was listening. Her fingers were clutching a pebble, that very one, the first one. Then there was a knock at the door. Byung-ho entered, his face ashen. He said 2 words. They're coming. The Black Ash Empire's army. 3,000. Moving from the north, they'll be at Hanzai in a week. And behind them, another detachment. From the south, the royal troops, 1,000. Huang Taimin is leading them. He brought the imperial forces, personally, because it's better to hand them over to the enemy than to leave them with a madman. 7 days. Wu Jin stood on the central tower of Hansei and counted 3,000 from the north, 1,000 from the south. Hansei's walls are designed to hold 1,000, not 4,000. But Hansei isn't just walls. Hansei is a trap. If the imperial troops enter, the city will close in around them. But 1,000 from the south is a different matter. Royal troops, our own. Huang Taimin is with them. With him are 20 battle mages from the academy. You don't use a trap city against your own people. Wu Jin went down. He gathered everyone. He explained, the plan is simple. The Imperials are marching on Hansai. We let them in. The city closes in, 3,000 in stone sacks, alive, unharmed. So Yon nodded. She knew the plan. She'd helped design it. Wu Jin continued. Huang Taimin is coming from the south. He's waiting for the Empire to destroy us. Then he'll arrive at the ruins and say he's sorry. If we stop the Empire, he'll arrive at an intact city, and he'll see that his plan has failed. Jia raised her hand. She said, he won't stop. If 3,000 Imperials are held captive and his 1,000 are outside, he'll seize the moment. He'll say he's freeing the prisoners. He'll strike at the weakened walls. Wu Jin said, I know, G.A. said. Then what? Wu Jin asked. He needs a reason, a right, a pretext. He's a master, not a bandit. He operates within the law. If he has no legal basis to attack sovereign territory, he won't attack, because it would ruin his reputation. And for him, reputation is more important than victory. Jia nodded. She said, you're right, I'll write him a letter on behalf of Princess Cheong-hei. Wu Jin blinked. She said, I'm still a princess, 3rd in line to the throne. My word carries weight. If I officially declare Hansei a territory under my protection, if I call upon the Chamber of Commerce to bear witness, and if I invite him to Hansei as a guest, not as a conqueror, he'll have to accept. Declining an invitation from the princess is an insult to the Cheong-hei crown. It would mean war between the kingdoms. He doesn't want that. Wu Jin looked at her. Then he said, you're brilliant. She said, I'm a prin. That's what we're taught. The letter was sent by courier that very day. There were 5 days left until the imperial forces arrived. Wu Jin was working. He was checking every mechanism in Hansei, every lever, every counterweight, every hinge. So Yan stood nearby and checked his work. So Ha-yun took up a position on the north wall. Emily organized the evacuation of non-combatants, women, children, and the elderly. Everyone left for Talmok along the road, keeping a safe distance. Mireille stayed behind. Wu Jin told her to leave. She looked at him, opened a book, pointed to a page. There was a calculation. Water consumption for 3,000 prisoners, food consumption, space requirements. She said, someone has to do the math. He didn't argue. Byung-ho distributed the weapons, 40 defenders on the walls. Spears, bows, swords, not for battle, just for show. The enemy must see the defenders, must see resistance, must enter. Hannah stood by the gate. Wu Jin approached her. He said, "Leave with the others." She didn't move. He said, "Please." She looked at him. Then she shook her head. Silently, he sighed. He said, "Then stay behind the inner wall. Don't come out." She nodded. 2 days until the enemy's arrival. Night. Wu Jin couldn't sleep. He sat on the wall and looked north, so Ha-un sat down beside him, silently. Then she said, "When it's all over, build me a house." He turned toward her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the horizon. She said, "Not a workshop, a house, with a kitchen, with a window, with a stove, a place where I can live." "Not to burn, to live." He said, "I'll build it." She nodded. She stood up. She left. Her hands glowed faintly with a golden light, the morning of the last day. The horizon had darkened, 3,000, a black mass. It moved across the plain like a shadow. The banners of the Empire of Black Ash, gray, with a black circle. Jin stood on the tower, So-yeon beside him, So Ha-un on the wall, Byung-ho at the gate, 40 men on the walls, against 3,000. The Imperial Army approached, stopped, assessed the situation. They saw Hants, 3 rings of walls, towers, a moat, a formidable fortress, but 3,000 against 40. The math was simple. The Imperial commander gave the order, assault, the first wave, 500. They advanced toward the walls. So Ha-un struck. Fire rained down on the front line, not lethal, just a barrage, a wall of flame in front of the moat. The Imperial troops stopped. They went around it. They found a bridge across the moat. Wu Jin had left it there on purpose. One bridge, narrow. They surged across the bridge, through the outer gates, inside. The first ring of walls, streets, houses, empty, quiet. They pressed deeper in. The second wave, 1,000, across the same bridge, through the same gates. The commander sent them in after the first wave. The third wave, the remaining 1,500. Everyone. They entered. 3,000 inside the outer ring. The streets led them deeper, toward the center, toward what looked like a square. Spacious, open, the perfect place to form up. The commander led the troops into the square. 3,000 men stood on the stone and looked at the inner walls. They were preparing to storm the second ring. Wu Jin stood on the central tower. He looked at So-yeon. She nodded. He placed his palms on the stone of the tower. He closed his eyes. The entire city of Hansai was in his mind. Every house, every wall, every lever, every mechanism. A city trap. His most complex project, his masterpiece. He pressed. Hansai collapsed. Not entirely. The outer ring. The walls shifted. The streets closed off. The passageways sealed shut. The square was divided by stone partitions. The houses pivoted. Walls rose from beneath the ground. The bridge behind the Imperial soldiers rose up and became a wall. The gates closed. 3,000 soldiers found themselves trapped in stone enclosures, 30 in each, stone walls 2 meters high, no roof, with air, with light. But no way out. Not a crypt, a pen. Not a single soldier was wounded. Not a single one died. They stood in their stone enclosures, unable to comprehend what had happened. The city around them had changed. It had been one thing. It had become another. Walls had risen where the streets used to be. The passageways had vanished. They were locked in the city, which had become a prison. The shock hit Wu Jin like a freight train. He didn't fall. He was already lying down. He placed his palms on the stone and remained lying on the tower. His consciousness was slipping away. He held on, holding on, to the very edge, to his last thought. Rice. They need rice. 3,000 mouths. In the morning, they'll want to eat. He lost consciousness. He woke up 4 hours later. His head was splitting. His body wouldn't obey him. But he was alive. And Hans was standing, and 3,000 soldiers were sitting in stone sacks, safe and sound. Byung-ho had organized the distribution, water, rice, through the walls. The soldiers of the Black Ash Empire sat in stone pens and ate rice, which was served to them by a man with the skill of a garbage collector. Jin came down from the tower. So-yeon and Byung-ho supported him by the arms. He walked between the stone pens, slowly, with difficulty. He looked at the faces beyond the walls, young, tired, frightened. They weren't monsters, they were soldiers. People who had been ordered to burn. They had burned. Now they sat in stone pens and ate rice. Woo Jin stopped at one of the pens, a young soldier, about 20 years old. He looked at Woo Jin through the wall. Woo Jin held out a bowl to him. He said, "Eat." The soldier took the bowl. He ate. Woo Jin moved on, to the next sack. To the next bowl. He handed out rice to the prisoners and muttered, "I can't let you starve. You're human after all." Hwang Tae-min arrived from the south, 1,000 royal soldiers, 20 battle mages. He rode up to Hanzé. He saw the walls, intact. He saw banners on the towers, not imperial ones. He saw So Ha-yoon on the wall holding a torch. He saw the closed gates. He had expected ruins. He had expected ashes. He had expected a dead city and a dead builder. Instead, the city stood, alive, intact, with lights, with smoke rising from the chimneys, with people on the walls. A courier emerged from the gates. He delivered a letter, an official invitation from Princess Park Ji-ah of the Kingdom of Zhonghe, to enter the city of Hanse as a guest, unarmed, for a conversation. Hwang Tae-min read the letter. His expression did not change, but his hands trembled. He recognized the princess's signature. He knew that refusal meant war between the kingdoms. He could not refuse. He entered, alone, unarmed, without mages. They led him through the city, past the stone bags, past 3,000 imperial soldiers who sat behind the walls eating rice. Hwang Tae-min walked and watched. His face was pale. He saw 3,000, alive, prisoners, not a single dead one, not a single wounded one. The city had taken the army without a single blow. He was led to the square in the inner ring. There was a table there. Seated at the table were Park Ji-ah, the princess, in a pristine dress bearing the Cheongha crest, Lee So-yeon, a military engineer with a sword at her belt, Emily Wright, with documents from the Chamber of Commerce, Yoon Mi-rae, with the ledger, So Ha-eun, with a smoldering fire in her palms, and Kang Woo-jin, in a dirty shirt, with bags under his eyes, with trembling hands, holding a bowl of rice, because he had just finished feeding the prisoners. Hwang Tae-min stood before them. He looked at Woo Jin for a long time. Then he said, "How?" Woo Jin said, "I built it." Hwang Tae-min said, "That's impossible." Woo Jin pointed to the walls, to the sacks, to the 3,000 living prisoners. He said, "And yet." Hwang Tae-min was silent. Then he said, "I kicked you out because you're useless." Woo Jin said, "You expelled me because you didn't understand." Hwang Tae-min said, "Stacking, it was a skill for the fair." Woo Jin said, "It was a skill for the fair, until someone who knows how to stack took it on." Park Ji-ah stood up. She spoke calmly, formally, like a princess. She said, "Master Hwang, you have brought enemies of the crown to the walls of a sovereign city. You have conspired with the Black Ash Empire. The Chamber of Commerce bears witness. My voice stands as testimony for the Cheonhae crown. You are hereby ordered to resign your authority or face trial before the court of the 5 kingdoms." Hwang Tae-min looked at her, at the princess who had spent half a year cooking soup in his ramshackle fortress, at the documents bearing seals, at the walls all around, at the prisoners beyond the walls. He had lost, not in battle, in strategy. He had been outmaneuvered by engineering, by trade, by law, by what he considered beneath him, not by magic, not by the sword, by paper and stone. He removed the magistrate's chain from his neck. He placed it on the table, turned around, and left. In silence, his 1,000 soldiers left with him, without a fight, without a single blow. Woo Jin sat at the table. He looked at the master's chain, then at the walls, then at the sky, at the 2 moons, one pale, the other red. Not a moon. An object. So Ha-eun stood on the eastern wall. Mireille stood on the western wall with a book, so Yeon stood by the gate. Emily stood on the tower, Jaisha stood in the square, all 6 of them. On different walls, they were looking at him, at this idiot in a dirty shirt who had just locked 3,000 soldiers in stone sacks and gone to feed them. Each was thinking her own thoughts, but all 6 were smiling in the same way.